Rain doesn't warn you. 1 second Manhattan is just Manhattan loud, indifferent, smelling of exhaust and wet asphalt, and the next second a man in a tailored suit is pressing his hand flat against a closet door while a woman pounds the wood from the inside, and nobody in the glittering ballroom 40 feet away hears a single sound. Baek Jun-song smoothed his lapel, checked his watch, and walked back toward the champagne. That's the kind of man he was. The kind who locks a woman in the dark and then goes looking for a drink. And if Kwon Si-hyeok had stayed at his own banquet like a reasonable person, like a man who trusted his organization, like someone who believed the evening would simply proceed the way it was, planned Jun-song might have gotten away with it. But Si-hyeok was not a reasonable person. He never had been. If you've ever felt invisible inside a room full of people who were supposed to see you, subscribe to the channel right now, because this story was made for you. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching, from I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And stay until the very end, because what happens inside that ballroom will change everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and who actually gets to walk out the front door. The Halcyon Imperial was the kind of hotel that made ordinary people feel like they were interrupting something. Everything about it said, "You don't belong here unless someone important brought you." The carpets absorbed sound. The chandeliers threw light in patterns that made faces look either luminous or severe, depending on what those faces were hiding. The ballroom on the 14th floor could seat 300 guests without feeling crowded, and on this particular October night, a sound like green wood splitting, it held exactly 312 people who all believed they were attending the most significant charitable event of the year. Kwon Si-hyeok knew 311 of them personally. He had spent 6 weeks preparing for this evening. Not because he cared about charitable optics, the way the invitation cards implied, but because Murray Crown Holdings needed a public face, needed photographs in newspapers, needed politicians photographed beside the company name, needed the kind of social legitimacy that allowed certain conversations to happen in certain offices without certain questions being asked too loudly. The banquet was armor. It always had been. Si-hyeok stood near the entrance to the main hall at 8:47, shaking hands he didn't want to shake, laughing at jokes he hadn't listened to, nodding at men whose names he'd forgotten before they finished introducing themselves. His dark suit fit the way expensive things fit when they're made specifically for one body, like it was simply part of him, like he'd been born wearing it. He was 41 years old, and he carried the weight of those years in a particular way, not in his posture, which remained straight, but in his eyes, which assessed every room the moment he entered it and never fully stopped assessing. He was looking for Zuri. Not because the evening required her, though it did, technically, since she had coordinated every element of it and carried backup copies of the presentation materials and knew the seating arrangements better than the hotel's own event staff. He was looking for her because it was 8:47 and she had been due, at his side, at 8:30, and Zuri Adebayo was never, under any circumstances, 17 minutes late. She probably got held up downstairs, said Park Dae-won, Si-hyeok's head of security, appearing at his elbow with the practiced silence of a large man who had spent 20 years learning to move quietly. Guest list verification was running slow. Check. Already sent someone. Si-hyeok accepted a glass of water from a passing server and did not drink it. He held it because holding something gave him a reason to keep his hands still. The ballroom was loud now. 300 people, generating the specific warmth and noise of wealth, performing itself, and normally, Si-hyeok could move through that noise like it didn't exist. Tonight it felt like interference. 8:53. Dae-won returned. His face said something before his mouth did. She's not downstairs. Guest services hasn't seen her. The car service confirmed she arrived at 8:15 and was escorted to the service entrance because the front was congested. The service entrance. Yes, Si-hyeok set the water glass on a nearby table. Pull the corridor footage. He said it quietly enough that no one around them heard, which was exactly how he said everything that mattered. Over 2 years of working beside him, Zuri had developed a private theory about this, that the quieter Si-hyeok's voice became, the larger the thing he was actually moving. She'd shared this theory with him once, half jokingly, and he'd looked at her with an expression. She couldn't entirely read something between surprised and unsettled, like she'd accurately described something he'd never articulated to himself. He thought about that now. Standing in his own ballroom among 300 people, he thought about Zuri's theory about his voice. Then he thought about her silver bracelet. She wore it every day, a delicate thing, not expensive, clearly personal, and he had never asked her where it came from because it wasn't his business, and she had never volunteered the information, and that was simply how their working relationship functioned. Professional, calibrated, mutual. He thought about that bracelet and then told himself he was overreacting. Then Daewon came back a third time, and he was holding something in his closed fist, and when he opened his hand, Si-hyeok saw the broken silver chain and stopped overreacting immediately. The service corridor behind the Halcyon's ballroom kitchen smelled like steam and industrial detergent and the specific kind of institutional cleanliness that exists to cover other smells. Si-hyeok moved through it without explaining himself to anyone he passed, kitchen staff, a sous chef who started to speak and then didn't, a hotel operations manager who saw Si-hyeok's face and pressed himself against the wall to let him through. Daewon walked 2 steps behind him. Neither of them spoke. The corridor split left toward the loading area and right toward a bank of storage and housekeeping rooms. Si-hyeok stopped at the junction and listened. The kitchen noise was loud enough to be disorienting, all that clanging metal and exhaust fan roar. He had spent enough years in enough difficult situations that he could filter that noise down without thinking about it. Peel back the layers of sound the way someone else might peel paper, and what was left underneath was a faint rhythmic impact. Muted, coming from the right. He was already moving before he'd consciously registered what it was. The housekeeping room was third door on the right, heavy steel with a standard keycard lock, and the lock was engaged. Si-hyeok put his hand flat against the door and felt the vibration clearly, now someone hitting the other side with the heel of their hand, measured and deliberate, like someone who had long since stopped screaming and was conserving energy. Daewon already had a master keycard. The hotel's head of security had handed it over without argument 4 minutes ago. When Daewon's expression made argument seem inadvisable, the door opened. Darkness inside. No light. The smell of cleaning supplies and something warmer underneath the particular warmth of a person who had been in a confined space for some time. Zuri was sitting on the floor with her back against a metal shelving unit, her knees drawn up, her elegant burgundy dress wrinkled and pulled sideways at the shoulder seam. Her heels were off. One had been used from the scuffs on its sole to bang against the door. Her face was wet, not from crying, he realized. Or not only from crying, from the effort of staying controlled in a space where there was no light and no way out. She looked up when the light from the corridor hit her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Si-hyeok had dealt with a great many difficult situations. He had sat across tables from people who wanted him destroyed. He had received news, more than once, that would have broken most people, and he had processed that news and responded to it and moved forward because that was what the situation required. He was not a man easily rattled by the sight of someone else's distress. But looking at Zuri Adebayo sitting on a housekeeping room floor in a dress she'd chosen for a formal event, in a hotel where he was the guest of honor, inside a room that someone had deliberately locked, something shifted in his chest that he didn't have a name for and didn't try to name. He crossed the threshold and knelt. Zuri, she exhaled. It was a complicated sound relief and anger and exhaustion compressed into a single breath. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "You're not fine." I know. I said it anyway. He almost said something that would have been the wrong thing, something about next steps, something that would have been appropriate in a boardroom and was completely inadequate here. He stopped himself. Who did this? Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was looking at them, deciding something. He could see her working through something, deciding something, or deciding how to say something she's already decided. Zuri processed things in a particular sequence. She identified what had happened. Then she identified how she felt about it. Then she identified what was necessary. He'd seen this sequence hundreds of times across conference tables and phone calls and last-minute document crises. and he recognized it happening now, even in this cramped, dark room. Jun Song, she said, Baek Jun Song and two of his people. The name sat in the air between them. Si-hyeok had known Jun Song for 11 years. A sound like green wood splitting. He had trusted him with numbers that could dismantle everything, with arrangements that existed nowhere in writing, with the financial architecture of an empire that had been built to survive scrutiny. Jun's was polished, intelligent, and careful, a Korean American who had navigated two worlds so fluently that he made it look effortless. "Tell me exactly what happened," Si-hyeok said. So she told him. It had started 6 weeks ago, which was also when the banquet preparations started, which was, Zuri had come to understand, not a coincidence. She had been processing the charitable fund documentation for the event, vetting donor records, confirming the designated recipient organizations, preparing the financial presentation that would run on the big screens during Jun Song's speech. Standard work, the kind of administrative work that passed through her hands constantly and that she'd learned, over 2 years, to read with a particular attention, because Si-hyeok's operation was large enough that small discrepancies could become large problems with no warning. She found the first irregularity in week 2. A transfer $700,000 routed through a foundation that didn't appear in any of the verified recipient documentation. She flagged it internally and went looking for the corresponding paperwork. What she found instead was a second transfer, then a third, then a pattern, shell foundations, holding names that didn't correspond to any registered charitable organization. Transfer amounts that individually were large, but not extraordinary, collectively were catastrophic. And woven through all of it, with the specific elegance someone who had designed financial structures for a living, was the unmistakable shape of a frame. The transfers were tagged, at their origin point, with authorization codes that connected to Si-hyeok's personal executive accounts. Zuri had sat with this information for 3 days. She had considered her options during those 3 days with a clarity that she recognized, even at the time, was partly shock. Part of her had expected to find something she could explain away. Part of her had expected a simple accounting error, a misfiled document, something boring and fixable. What she'd found instead was deliberate, sophisticated, and designed to destroy a specific person. Copied the files, all of them. She made 3 copies, one encrypted on an external drive she kept at home, one embedded in the banquet presentation system inside a folder that looked like blank event photography, and one uploaded to a cloud account registered to an email address she'd created 2 years earlier during a security training exercise, and had never used since. Then she said nothing and waited. She was waiting to understand why. Because the documents told her what Jun Song had done and who he was framing, but they didn't tell her what he wanted, what outcome he was building toward, what conversation or transaction the banquet was supposed to enable. She needed to understand the full shape of it before she moved. She almost had it. 2 nights before the banquet, she'd found the final piece, a meeting request in Jun Song's calendar, buried under routine agenda items, scheduled for 9:45 on the night of the event, after his speech, when the financial presentation would be finalized in the system, and the transfers would process automatically unless someone interrupted it. She was going to interrupt it. She'd had a plan. It was not the plan she ended up using. Jun Song found her in the hotel's business center at 6:30 on the evening of the banquet, 2 hours before the event began. She had come in to confirm the presentation system was running correctly, and it was, which meant her backup files were still embedded exactly where she'd put them. He came in with 2 men she recognized as mid-level executives from the Myre Crown Financial Division. Their suits were expensive. Their expressions were not. "Miss Adebayo," Jun Song said. He closed the door behind him. Zuri had spent 2 weeks preparing for this conversation. She had scripts for it, mental rehearsals, calculated responses to probable approaches. She had considered herself ready. She was not ready for how ordinary he looked saying it. How calm, how entirely unsurprised, like this was simply the next task on his schedule. "You've been in the financial files," he said. "It's my job. There are things in those files that aren't appropriate for your role." That's a strange way to describe fraud, One of the men moved to her right. The other stayed near the door. Jun-song's expression didn't change. The files, he said, external drive, cloud backup. Whatever else you have, you'll give them to me now, or we'll have a very different kind of conversation. I don't have them with me, I think you do. She didn't. She'd made sure of that the physical drive was at her apartment. The cloud backup existed on a server he couldn't touch without the specific login credentials she'd memorized and never written down. What was here, in this hotel, was the copy embedded in the presentation system, and she had no intention of giving him any indication that it existed. They took her phone. They took her bag. They walked her out of the business center through a service corridor while a hotel cleaning crew moved in the opposite direction and looked at their carts and said nothing, because that is what people do when they sense something is wrong and have calculated in the half-second available that it is not their problem. The housekeeping room was not Jun-song's idea. She'd later understand. It was efficient, temporary, a place to contain a problem for approximately 3 hours, long enough for his speech, long enough for the transaction to process, long enough for everything to become irreversible. Before he closed the door, Jun-song paused. "No one is going to come looking for you," he said. It was not a threat, exactly. He said it the way someone delivers information they consider objectively true. You understand that, don't you? You're the secretary. People will assume you had an emergency. They'll manage without you. He closed the door. The lock engaged. And in the dark, Zuri sat down on the floor and thought about whether he was right. She told Si-hyeok all of it. She told him without softening the parts that were hardest: Jun-song's calm, the men's positioning, the specific words he'd used at the end. She told him because the situation required complete information and because she had learned in 2 years of working beside this man that he used whatever he was given accurately and didn't waste it. She did not tell him how long she sat in the dark before she started hitting the door. That was her own thing. Si-hyeok listened without interrupting. Sound. This was something she'd noticed about him early, that he could absorb significant information without his face, moving through the performance of absorbing it. Other people, when they were processing something serious, telegraphed it, the slight forward lean, the tightening around the eyes, the small movements that said, "I am taking this in." Si-hyeok simply went still, like he was conserving something. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The backup in the presentation system," he said. "Is it still there?" "It should be. Unless he's had someone access the event tech in the last..." She looked at his watch, because her phone was gone, hour. "His speech is scheduled for 9:15. "Yes." "It's 8:58. 17 minutes. Zuri looked at the open doorway. Corridor light was harsh and flat after the dark. Beyond it she could hear, faint and distant, the sound of the ballroom, 300 voices, generating the warm blur of collective performance. "I need to get to the presentation system before his speech starts," she said. "You need to go home," Si-hyeok said. "Daewon will have a car." "No." He looked at her. She looked back at him. "He said no one would come looking," she said. "He said I was just the secretary, that people would assume I had an emergency and manage without me." She kept her voice flat. She was working very hard to keep her voice flat. "I spent 2 weeks building that evidence. It's the only complete copy that's accessible tonight. If Jun-song completes his speech, the transaction processes, and by the time anyone reconstructs what happened, every trail leads to you, and everything he built disappears into 3 different banking jurisdictions." Silence. "I'm not going home," she said. Si-hyeok studied her for a long moment with that particular stillness of his. She had the sense, not for the first time, that he was running calculations. She couldn't see weighing probabilities, outcomes, contingencies. He was very good at this. It was in many ways the thing he was best at. Then he stood up and held out his hand. Not the gesture of someone helping her to her feet. The gesture of someone indicating a direction. Together. Zuri looked at his hand. She was barefoot on a service corridor floor. Her dress was damaged. Her face still showed the evidence of the last hour. And in 14 minutes, a man who had locked her in a closet was going to try to dismantle everything she'd spent weeks building. She took Si-hyeok's hand and stood. "There's a staff bathroom 20 feet from the ballroom entrance," she said. 2 minutes, you have them. She found her shoes. Put them on. She looked at the closet door at the dark space beyond it, the shelving unit she'd leaned against, the floor she'd sat on, and then she looked away. Some things you don't give more attention than they require. They walked back toward the ballroom together, and the sound of 300 unsuspecting guests grew louder with every step. And somewhere inside that room, Baek Jun-song was finishing champagne and reviewing his notes and believing, completely, that the evening was already won. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. The staff bathroom near the ballroom entrance was a single occupancy room with a mirror the size of a door and fluorescent lighting that showed everything a person might prefer not to see about themselves. Zuri stood in front of that mirror for exactly 2 minutes, which was what she had asked for and what she had. She smoothed the dress at the shoulder where the seam had pulled. The fabric sat wrong. There was a small tear at the sleeve that she couldn't fix and didn't try to. She ran cold water and pressed her fingers under her eyes, which helped some. She found a paper towel and did what she could with it. She looked at herself in the mirror with the particular blankness of someone who has moved past the point where feelings are useful and has not yet reached the point where they can afford to feel anything again. She looked tired. Her hair had held, because she'd pinned it carefully before leaving her apartment 4 hours ago, which felt like a different lifetime. The burgundy dress, damaged, was still the dress she'd chosen. She was still the person who had chosen it. That was going to have to be enough. She opened the door, and Si-hyeok was standing exactly where she'd left him, in the narrow corridor outside the bathroom, his hands at his sides, watching the ballroom entrance with the expression of a man reviewing a tactical situation. Splitting. He didn't look at her with the kind of careful assessment that would have said, "I'm checking to see if you're holding together." He just looked at her the way he always did, like she was a person who had information and a function and was expected to perform both. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. "System access?" he said. "The presentation laptop is on the stage setup table. Stage left. Been there since 6 o'clock. I configured it myself." She pulled at the sleeve of her dress, a small adjustment that didn't fix the tear, but gave her hand something to do. The folder is named Event Photography Backup 2. It looks like an empty folder with corrupted image files. You'd have to know what you were looking for. Jun-song's technical people, could they have found it? Only if they knew it existed. I didn't tell anyone. She paused. I didn't tell anyone anything. For 6 weeks. Something moved through his expression at that briefly, and then it was gone. Day 1, Si-hyeok said, not raising his voice. Day 1 materialized from the corridor's shadow with the reliability of a man who had spent 2 decades being summoned this way. He was a large person who moved like a smaller one, and he held his body with the specific economy of someone who has been in enough real situations to have stopped performing readiness and simply maintained it. Stage left setup table, Si-hyeok said. Laptop. Nobody touches it. Nobody moves it. Nobody sends a technician to adjust anything on that stage for any reason until I say otherwise. And Jun-song's people. How many did you clock in the room? Jun-song himself. Ryu Tae-min from the financial division, he's at table 7. Han Soo-chan, he came in with Jun-song's group. He's been near the bar since 8. Day 1's jaw tightened slightly. I didn't flag them because they had legitimate credentials. All 3 are on the guest list. They are on the guest list, Si-hyeok said. Because I put them there. He said it without particular emphasis, as a statement of fact. Watch them. Don't move on them. Nothing changes visibly until the speech begins. Day 1 nodded and disappeared. Zuri watched the space where he'd been. He's going to know something is wrong, she said. Jun-song. The moment he sees me walk through those doors. Yes. He'll try to stop the presentation. He'll try. He has people in that room. So do I. Si-hyeok turned toward the ballroom entrance. Zuri. She looked at him. When we walk in, he said, "Don't look at him first. Look at the room." She didn't ask why. She understood why, because the first person you look at tells everyone in a room what you're afraid of, and she was not going to walk through those doors, telegraphing fear to 300 observers. She was going to walk through those doors, like a woman who had chosen to be there. Which was exactly what she was. Si-hyeok straightened his jacket. She noticed without meaning to that his hands were completely steady. Then the ballroom doors opened and the sound hit them like a wave warmth and noise, and 300 people who had no idea what was about to happen, and they walked in. The room registered their entrance the way expensive rooms register anything unexpected, a ripple. A slight shift in the conversational current near the doors, heads turning by proximity, and then further, the way a disturbance moves through water. 300 guests, and in the space of 15 seconds, a noticeable fraction of them had taken in the fact that Kwon Si-hyeok had just returned to his own event with his executive secretary at his side, and something in his posture that was not the posture of a man who had stepped out for fresh air. Zuri felt the stairs land on her like small weights. She kept her eyes moving, scanning the room the way Si-hyeok had told her to, reading it, mapping it. Table arrangements, exit positions, the stage still brightly lit, the podium standing empty, because Jun-song had not yet taken his place. Presentation laptop, visible from here, sitting on the setup table exactly where she'd left it. And then she found Jun-song. He was at the far end of the room, near the bar, in conversation with two investors she recognized from the pre-event briefing materials. His champagne glass was half full. His tie was perfect. He was laughing at something one of the investors had said, the specific practiced laugh of a man who has performed charm long enough that it no longer required conscious effort. He hadn't seen them yet. Zuri watched him laugh and felt something cold move through her chest that wasn't fear. She identified it after a moment. It was the specific anger of someone who has been underestimated so completely that the underestimation became its own kind of injury. Jun-song had locked her in a closet and then come back to drink champagne and laugh with investors because he had calculated with full confidence that she would not be a factor. She was going to be a factor. Si-hyeok had moved slightly ahead of her to redirect a conversation with the event conversation, something about the schedule, conducted quietly, the event coordinator nodding rapidly, and the moment his attention was divided, Zuri took the opportunity to assess the room for herself. Ryu Taemin was at table 7, as Daewon had said. He was a lean man with watchful eyes who had always made her faintly uneasy in the office, the kind of person who asked precise questions and processed the answers with an expression that revealed nothing. Tonight he was sitting very still for someone at a dinner table, which meant he was waiting. Han Soo-chan, near the bar, was closer to Jun-song than a casual observer would have noticed. Not beside him, that would have been obvious, but positioned at an angle that covered the room's eastern exit. She recognized the positioning because she'd spent 2 years watching Si-hyeok's security people do exactly the same thing at exactly these kinds of events. Jun-song had brought his own security arrangement to this party. Inside Si-hyeok's party, the audacity of it pressed against her ribs. Then Jun-song turned. Their eyes met across 300 people and 30 feet of polished ballroom floor, and for 1 second, just one, she saw his composure crack. Not fully, not dramatically. The crack was small and fast, and would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically watching for it. A slight tightening of the jaw, a stillness that came over him, the way stillness comes over a person who has just received information that requires rapid recalculation. He hadn't expected her to be standing. He hadn't expected her to be here. Zuri held his gaze for exactly as long as felt deliberate, and then she looked away first, which she did, because looking away first looked like indifference, and indifference was more damaging than defiance. She heard the investor beside Jun-song say something, and Jun-song laugh again, but this time the laugh was a half-second late. The next 11 minutes were the longest of her professional life. Sek worked the room in the way he always worked. Rooms at these events efficiently, purposefully, moving through conversations with the practiced ease of someone who has learned that sustained social performance is its own form of strategy. He accepted 2 more drinks he didn't consume. He redirected 3 conversations that wanted to become extended, and he positioned himself by the end of 9 minutes in a location that was equidistant from the stage, the main doors, and the table where Ryu Taemin was sitting. Zuri stayed close enough that their proximity was clearly deliberate, and far enough that she could watch the room independently. Taemin noticed them. She saw it the slight shift in his posture when Si-hyeok settled into his position, the way Taemin's eyes moved to Jun-song and then away too quickly. Across the room, Jun-song had extracted himself from the investors and was moving toward the staging area with the unhurried walk of a man who was simply checking on logistics. But Zuri tracked the line of his movement and saw that he was angling toward the stage setup table. Toward the laptop, she turned and found Si-hyeok with her eyes. He had already seen it. He made a small gesture with 2 fingers at hip level, invisible to anyone not looking for it, and somewhere behind her, she heard a shift in Daewon's weight. Jisong reached the setup table. A young event technician was standing there adjusting cable routing, and Jun-song spoke to him briefly, gesturing toward the laptop, and the technician nodded and reached for it. "Excuse me," Si-hyeok said. His voice carried exactly far enough. The technician stopped. Jun-song turned. The distance between the 3 of them was 12 feet, and every inch of it was charged. Sai crossed the distance without rushing. He stopped beside the table, looked at the technician with the specific quality of attention that large, quiet men use when they want a smaller person to make a good decision. And the technician took a half step back and found something else to do immediately. Jun-song looked at Si-hyeok. Si-hyeok looked at Jun-song. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Around them, the ballroom continued 300 people. Noise, warmth, champagne. The magnificent, indifferent machinery of a formal event in full operation. And inside that silence between the 2 men was its own separate climate. "Sakya!" Jun-song's voice was smooth. Whatever crack had appeared in his composure when he'd spotted Zuri across the room had been repaired. He had good construction. Jun-song, his surface held under pressure, better than most people's. "I didn't realize you'd stepped away. I found something I was looking for," Si-hyeok said. Jun-song's eyes moved to Zuri, who had positioned herself 6 feet to Si-hyeok's left and was watching him, with her hands folded in front of her, in the posture she used when she was containing something large. "Miss Adebayo," Jun-song said. "I heard there was some kind of issue earlier." "I'm glad you don't," Zuri said. The word came out clean and flat and stopped Jun-song mid-sentence with the efficiency of something physical. A couple near the adjacent table glanced over. Jun-song's jaw moved slightly. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," Zuri said. "Don't explain. Don't tell me there was a misunderstanding. I was in that room for 70 minutes. I know what happened. You know what happened. And the only question now is what happens next." She kept her voice level. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for exactly this in the dark of that closet, what she would say when she was on the other side of it. "Don't waste my time." Silence. Jun-song looked at Si-hyeok. "She's clearly been through something distressing." She should what?" Si-hyeok said. His voice had dropped to the register that Zuri had once described as the signal that something large was moving. "Finish your sentence." Jun-song didn't finish the sentence. The event coordinator's voice came through the room's sound system, apologetic, professional, announcing that the formal portion of the evening would begin in 5 minutes and requesting that guests find their seats. 5 minutes. Jun-song's eyes moved to the laptop on the table. Then to Si-hyeok. Then to the room calculating. Zuri understood. Whether there was a version of the next 5 minutes in which he could still recover the situation. "This is a misunderstanding that can be resolved quietly," he said. Quiet voice now. Careful voice. "Whatever Zuri has told you." "Her name," Si-hyeok said, "is Miss Adebayo, and she hasn't told me anything I didn't verify." He paused. "The transaction is frozen." Jun-song. "I called it in from the corridor before we came back in here." Something happened in Jun-song's face that was not quite a flinch, but was in the same family. "The accounts," Si-hyeok continued, "the shell foundations, the transfer, routing our financial compliance team, has had the full documentation for the last 18 minutes. Independent counsel received a copy 20 seconds later. He tilted his head slightly, a false movement that somehow conveyed the full weight of what he was describing. "I wasn't going to give you time to start a counter-narrative." Jun-song went very still. Across the room, Taemin stood up from his chair. Near the bar, Han Suchan straightened. And around them, the ballroom continued its magnificent, oblivious warmth. What happened next happened in compressed time, the way emergencies always do, a sequence of moments that would later feel much longer in memory than they actually were. Taemin moved toward the stage. Daewon stepped into his path from what appeared to be nowhere, and the two of them had a brief, quiet exchange in the shadow of the east wall that consisted entirely of Daewon saying 3 words and Taemin assessing the size differential between them and deciding to stand still. Han Soo-chan near the bar took out his phone. One of Daewon's people, a compact woman in a server's uniform who had been moving through the room for the past hour with a tray and a convincing performance of invisibility, stopped beside the bar and put her hand lightly on the counters beside. Soo-chan's in a gesture that looked social and wasn't. Soo-chan looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression that required no translation. Soo-chan put his phone in his pocket. Jun-song had watched all of this. He was good at reading rooms that was in many ways the foundation of his professional value, and he read this one accurately and completely in about 4 seconds. His face went through something that Zuri had not expected to see on it, not anger, not calculation, but something raw. Something that looked, beneath the expensive surface, almost like fear. She had expected anger. Anger she had prepared for. Fear from a man like Jun-song was different. Fear was what people felt when they had run out of options. "You're going to destroy yourself doing this," Jun-song said. His voice was low now, aimed at Si-hyeok, and the smoothness had come out of it. "The accounts are connected to you, Si-hyeok. Your authorizations. Your access codes. It goes public," Si-hyeok said. "The organization. I know what it costs. You'll lose the Sungjin arrangement. The Dongsan connections. Everything you've built with the Park family over the last 6 years." Jun-song. Si-hyeok's voice was very quiet now. "You locked my executive secretary in a closet." The sentence sat there. Jun-song opened his mouth. "A woman who works for me," Si-hyeok continued, each word placed with the care of someone placing weight on uncertain ground to demonstrate it will hold. "In my hotel. At my event. You assessed the situation and concluded that she could be contained because she was only the secretary, that the people around her would assume she'd had an emergency, that no one would come looking." Silence. "I want you to understand," Si-hyeok said, "that I came looking." Jun-song looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Zuri, really looked at her, possibly for the first time that evening, with something that wasn't strategy or missiles or calculation. Then the event coordinator's voice came through the sound system again. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would please take your seats, we'll be beginning our program momentarily." The room shifted. Guests moved toward tables. The ambient noise reorganized itself into the specific configuration of an audience preparing to be addressed. And Jun-song made a decision. Zuri saw it happen the moment the decision crystallized behind his eyes. Whatever calculation had been running had finished running, and the output was visible in the set of his shoulders and the way his chin came up. He turned and walked toward the stage. Si-hyeok started to move, and Zuri caught his sleeve. He stopped and looked at her. "Let him get to the microphone," she said quietly. "Let him start his speech." She held his gaze. "I need him at that podium when the screens change. If you stop him now, he walks out of here with a legal team and a narrative. If he's standing at that microphone when 300 people see what's in those files." She paused. "He can't walk away from that." Si-hyeok looked at her for a moment that held several kinds of weight. Then he stepped back. Jun-song reached the stage steps. He straightened his jacket. He climbed. He stepped to the podium and looked out at 300 people arranging themselves into an audience. And for a moment, just a moment, before the room fully settled, his eyes found Zuri across all that space and held. She didn't look away this time. He picked up the microphone. "Good evening," he said. His voice through the sound system was warm and practiced and filled the room beautifully. "Thank you all for being here." Zuri moved to the stage-left setup table. The laptop was there. The folder was there. Her hands were shaking finely, not catastrophically, the kind of shaking that exists at the margin of control. She opened the folder. The files were exactly where she'd put them. Jun-song's voice filled. The ballroom behind her, the opening of a speech she'd proofread herself weeks ago before she knew what the speech was really doing. She could hear him building toward the charitable foundation segment, the part where the numbers would be presented, and the transfers would process, and the evening would conclude its real function beneath its stated one. She plugged in the drive. Her hands were shaking. "Miss Adebayo," said a voice directly behind her. She turned. Ryu Taemin was standing 3 feet away, and he was not standing there by accident, and the expression on his face said that Daewon's deterrence had not held as long as intended. "Step away from the laptop," Taemin said. He said it quietly, the way Junsong said everything like a statement of operational reality rather than a request. Zuri looked at him. She looked at the laptop. She looked at the room, 300 people facing forward, facing Junsong, facing the stage where Junsong's speech was building toward its crescendo. She looked back at Taemin. "No," she said, he moved. And from the other side of the setup table, from the shadow at the edge of the stage, Si-hyeok stepped forward and put himself between them with a completeness that required no additional communication, and the look on his face stopped Taemin with the efficiency of something that had no polite name. The ballroom was full of light and noise, and 300 people who didn't know they were sitting in the middle of something that was about to split open. Jun Song's voice swelled toward the presentation cue. Zuri's hand steadied. She pressed the button that changed the screens. And the ballroom, all its light, all its warmth, all 300 faces turned toward the images that appeared on those screens, and the silence that followed was the kind of silence that precedes, the things that cannot be taken back. There was no path backward from this moment. There was only what came next. The first image hit the screens at 9:22. Bank transfer records. Column after column of routing numbers, and account names and dollar figures that individually meant nothing to most of the 300 people seated in the Halcyon Imperial's ballroom, but collectively told a story that was impossible to misread. The foundation names were there: Mirai Sunrise Initiative, Crown Charitable Partners, Seoul American Community, Trust, all of them bearing the branding language of legitimacy, all of them hollow, all of them connected by a web of transaction arrows that converged on 3 private accounts in 2 countries. The room didn't explode, it went quiet first. That specific quality of quiet, the kind that happens when 300 people simultaneously realize that the event they're attending has become something else entirely, settled over the ballroom like a change in air pressure. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A woman near the front lowered her champagne glass slowly, as if the motion required all her concentration. A senator from the Finance Committee, seated at table 4 with his communications director, leaned forward and put on his reading glasses. Junsong stood at the podium. He had mid-sentence, something about the Foundation's community impact metrics, the careful language Zuri had proofread, and that now felt like reading evidence at your own trial, and the sentence simply stopped existing. His eyes went to the screens. His mouth stayed slightly open, in the shape of the word he hadn't finished. 3 seconds. 5. 8. That's... He started. His voice came through the sound system, and 300 heads turned back toward him, and the attention of 300 people landing on him simultaneously was visibly something he felt. His jaw closed. He straightened. Then the second image appeared. Shell Corporation registration documents. Offshore. The signatory on 2 of the 3 primary accounts was listed under a name that meant nothing to most of the room, a holding structure. Deliberately obscure, but the authorization codes embedded in the transfer documentation were indexed to a specific executive access level within Mirai Crown Holdings' internal financial system. And 2 of the guests at table 12 had enough financial sector experience to read what that indexing meant, and Zuri could see the moment they read it in the way they turned to each other. She was standing at the laptop, and her hands had stopped shaking, and she was watching the room with the focus of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a particular moment and is now inside it and cannot afford to experience it emotionally yet. Taemin had not moved again after Si-hyeok stepped between them. He was still to her left, 3 feet back, and he was watching Junsong with an expression that Zuri recognized after a moment as calculation, the expression of a man rapidly determining what loyalty was currently worth and whether the math still held. Si-hyeok stood at the foot of the stage steps. He had not moved either. He was watching Junsong with the particular attention he gave to situations. He had already decided on not the attention of someone still deciding, but of someone waiting for the specific moment to act. Jun-song stepped away from the podium. He didn't run. He was too controlled for that. He moved with the deliberate pace of someone who has decided that visible urgency is more damaging than measured movement, angling toward the stage steps on the far, right away from Si-hyeok, away from Daewon, toward the east wing corridor that connected backstage to the hotel's service elevator bank. Jun-song, Si-hyeok said, his voice without the microphone, still carried to the first 6 rows of tables. The quality of it not raised, not theatrical, simply placed into the room with the precision of someone who knows exactly how sound travels, stopped at least 40 conversations. Jun-song stopped walking. The room was watching now. Fully watching. Whatever social performance had been sustaining. The evening's facade had dissolved in the last 90 seconds, and 300 people were sitting in the ruins of it trying to understand what they were witnessing. Si-hyeok moved to the stage. He took the steps in 2 strides, crossed to the podium, and picked up the microphone that Jun-song had set down. "I apologize for the disruption to the evening," he said. He was not looking at the room. When he said it, he was looking at Jun-song, standing 10 feet away at the edge of the stage, not quite leaving and not quite staying. "This presentation has been modified from its original format. What you're looking at is accurate financial documentation that my team has already transmitted to independent counsel and federal financial investigators." He paused. "I'm asking you to remain seated while the hotel's security team secures the exits. Not to detain you to ensure that 3 specific individuals do not leave the building before investigators arrive downstairs." A sound went through the room, not quite a gasp. More like the collective exhalation of people who have stopped pretending they know what kind of evening this is. Jun-sing turned around. He looked at Si-hyeok across the stage with an expression that had finally dropped all of its careful construction, and what was underneath was something Zuri had not anticipated. Not just calculation, not just the fear she'd seen beginning to surface earlier. What was underneath looked like genuine fury, the specific fury of a man who believes he has been wronged by the very person he was trying to destroy. That fury was information. Zuri filed it without fully understanding it yet. "You want to do this publicly," Jun-song said. He didn't need the microphone. His voice carried on its own, and the room was quiet enough, now that everyone heard him. "You want to put everything in front of these people." He gestured at the assembled guests with a motion that was almost contemptuous. "Fine. Let's do it publicly." He straightened his jacket. And then he said something that Zuri had not prepared for. "Show them the rest of the files," Jun-song said. Silence. "Show them all of it," he said, "not just the transfers. The origination accounts. Where the initial capital came from before it moved through my structures." He looked at Zuri directly now, across the stage, across the laptop, across everything she'd built. "Go ahead. Pull the full ledger history. Let's show these people what Mirai Crown Holdings actually is." The room was absolutely still. Zuri looked at the laptop. Files she'd compiled, at the folder structure she'd navigated for 6 weeks. And something cold moved through her, the specific cold of someone who has just understood that the ground they're standing on has more depth than they measured. She understood it fully 17 minutes later, in the green room behind the stage, when Si-hyeok sat down across from her and put a second drive on the table between them. The green room was small and fluorescently lit, and smelled like old coffee, the particular staleness of a room that existed to be transited rather than occupied. There was a love seat against one wall, 2 chairs, a folding table, and a sound monitor that was still live. She could hear the ballroom through it, the specific texture of 300 people managing collective shock in real time, the hotel's event coordinator making announcements, Daewon's voice at intervals directing his people. Si-hyeok set the drive on the table and looked at it, and then looked at her. "How much did you find?" he said. She looked at the drive. She had not seen it before. It was a different model from the drive she'd been working with older, the casing worn at one corner. "Weeks of documentation," she said carefully. "Every transfer I could trace. Every shell account I could identify. Every connection back to the origination accounts in the Mirai Crown system." "The origination accounts," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The sound monitor carried a fragment of conversation from the ballroom, a woman's voice. sharp with something, and then it receded. What do you know about how Mirai Crown was capitalized? Si-hyeok said. Zuri had worked for this organization for 2 years. She had processed financial documentation, coordinated with legal teams, managed executive schedules, handled the administrative architecture of an operation she had known from the beginning, was not entirely what its public materials suggested. She had known this and chosen to stay because the work was real and the compensation was substantial, and she had made a private arrangement with us about the limits of what she would and would not look directly at. She had not looked directly at the origination question. She had traced the transfers forward from Mirai Crown's accounts outward and had been thorough and precise about it. She had not looked backward at where the money had come from before it became Mirai Crown's money. She had not looked because she had not wanted to know. She understood now that this had been a mistake. "Tell me," she said. Si-hyeok put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment, the specific posture of someone preparing to say something that cannot be taken back once it's been said. 12 years ago, he said, Mirai Crown Holdings was capitalized with funds from 3 sources. A legitimate investment group from Seoul, a private family trust based in Hong Kong, and a third source that did not have a name that could appear in documentation. He paused. That third source was the operational revenue of a criminal organization that I ran for 9 years before I began the transition out. Zuri looked at him. The origination capital is traceable, he said. If someone with sufficient technical skill and access to the right international banking records spent enough time working backward through the holding structures, they could establish a direct financial line between Mirai Crown's founding capital and criminal proceeds. He looked at her. Jun Song has spent the last 3 years building that trace. He didn't just construct a frame, he reconstructed the real history, and then layered the fraudulent transfers on top of it, so that when everything came apart, investigators would find both. The room was very quiet. He wasn't framing you for something you didn't do, Zuri said slowly. He was framing me for something I did do, Si-hyeok said. 12 years ago, with documentation that makes the timeline look current. The cold she'd felt on the stage returned, and this time it settled in and stayed. She sat with this for a moment. She was doing the sequence she always did, identifying what had happened, identifying how she felt about it, identifying what was necessary. The first part was clear now. The second part she pushed to the side because there wasn't room for it yet. The third part was what mattered. If the investigators find the origination trace, she said. They will find it, Si-hyeok said. It's there. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. Then what you gave them tonight is the fraud layer, which is real, which is Jun Song's work, not mine. He looked at her steadily. But underneath the fraud layer is a history that I cannot make disappear, and that Jun Song has specifically constructed to surface alongside it. Zuri stood up. She didn't have a destination. The room was 15 feet across. She just needed the movement. She walked to the wall and turned and walked back. Planned this over 3 years, she said, at least. He worked inside your organization for 11 years and spent the last 3 building a case that uses your real history as the foundation and his fraud as the detonator. Yes, and he expected what? That you'd find the fraud layer yourself eventually, and the investigation you launched would expose the origination history and destroy you more completely than a direct accusation, Si-hyeok said. Because a direct accusation could be defended. A self-investigation that uncovers your own criminal history in front of federal investigators, in front of 300 witnesses, at your own charitable event. He paused. There's no defense for that. Zuri stopped moving. The sound monitor carried another fragment from the ballroom, Daewon's voice, clipped and directive, and then the ambient hum of a room still in managed crisis. He wanted you to find the fraud, she said. He wanted you to expose it. He wanted to make certain the investigations I triggered would go deep enough to find everything underneath. But I found it first. She was working through it out loud, following the logic. I found the fraud layer before he was ready. He wasn't prepared for the banquet to become the exposure event he'd planned for it to process quietly tonight, for the money to move, and then for the irregularities to surface later during a routine compliance review where there'd be time to. She stopped. Wait. Si-hyeok waited. If he planned for the fraud to surface during a compliance review, she said, he needed the fraud to already be complete before the review happened. The Banquet transaction needed to process. The money needed to move. She looked at him. Which means the real evidence, the origination trace he built, wasn't going to be triggered by the Banquet. It was going to be triggered by something else. Something timed for after. Silence. What's scheduled after tonight, she said. Si-hyeok's expression shifted in a way she had not seen before, a very small movement, barely a change, but on a face that changed as little as his. It was seismic. A federal financial review, he said. Routine. Scheduled 6 months ago, before any of this. Quarterly compliance examination of Micre Crown's charitable division. When? 3 weeks from today. Zuri put her hand on the back of the chair. He was going to let the Banquet transaction process tonight, she said. Let the money move. And then 3 weeks from now, when federal reviewers went into the charitable division's records, they would find the fraud layer, and underneath it, because he'd made sure the trace was there, they would find the origination history. And you would have already triggered your own preliminary disclosure tonight by releasing the fraud documentation. She looked at him. You would have handed them the thread, and they would have pulled it, and it would have unraveled everything. Yes, Si-hyeok said, and now you've handed them the thread anyway. Yes, tonight, in front of 300 people. Before the transaction processed, and before you understood what was underneath it. Si-hyeok looked at her without changing his expression. I handed them the thread, he said, because you were in a closet. The sentence sat in the room. Zuri looked at him. He looked back at her with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and she understood in a way she could not have articulated, in a way that fit neatly into professional language, that he was not offering this as an excuse. He was offering it as a fact, a causal statement, a thing that had happened because another thing had happened first. She had been in the closet, so he had handed them the thread. That was the math. And he had done it knowing she was now certain. He had known that the thread was longer than she'd found. You knew about the origination trace, she said. He didn't look away. Not the specifics, he said. Not how he'd constructed it or how complete it was. But I knew the history was traceable if someone looked hard enough. I knew it was a vulnerability. He paused. I had begun to suspect in the last few weeks that Jun-sung knew it too. And you didn't tell me, no. I was building a case. Documenting everything I could find and making copies and embedding backup files in presentation systems. And I was doing all of that without knowing that the material I was working with was sitting on top of a bomb. Yes, Zuri stood with that. In the hallway outside the green room, she could hear footsteps, multiple people, purposeful, the specific rhythm of people moving with authority. Investigators, she supposed, or hotel security coordinating with investigators, or some combination. The evening was still unfolding in every direction. Why? She said. Not why you didn't tell me earlier. I understand operational compartmentalization. I've worked here long enough to understand that. Why did you expose the fraud tonight, knowing the investigation it triggered would reach the history underneath, when you could have found another way to... There wasn't another way, Si-hyeok said. There was the way that kept everything quiet and left you in that closet. Or there was this. His voice was completely even. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, quietly, without performance, placed into the room as a simple statement of what was true. Zuri looked at him for a long time. The federal review in 3 weeks, she said finally. Yes. They're going to find the origination trace. Yes. Even with the fraud documentation framing Jun-song, even with everything I compiled, they're going to go deeper. Probably. What happens then? Si-hyeok was quiet for a moment. The sound monitor carried a burst of activity from the ballroom voices, movement, the distinct compression of a large space being managed. Then it settled. I don't know yet, he said. It was the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say. She pulled out the chair and sat back down, across from him. The drive was still on the table between them, and she looked at it, the worn corner, the older model casing, the weight of what it contained. Is that the origination documentation? She said. It's everything, Si-hyeok said. Everything I have. Everything I know about how the trace was constructed and where it leads and what it connects to. You're giving it to me. I'm giving it to you. Why? He looked at her across the table with the stillness that she had once described, half jokingly, as the signal that something large was moving. She understood now that she had been right about that. She had been right about it from the beginning, and she was sitting at a table with the evidence of exactly how right she'd been, and it was a complicated thing to hold. Because Jun Song was right about one thing, Si-hyeok said. The investigation I triggered tonight will go wherever it goes. I can't control the depth of it, but you can control what the investigators understand. Before they go deep, what context they have, what sequence they see the evidence in, whether the origination history reads as current fraud or as a 12-year-old structural problem that the organization has been transitioning away from. He paused. That framing matters. The difference between those two readings is the difference between the end of everything and something survivable. You want me to build the contextual case, she said. I want you to build whatever you think is true, he said. If you look at everything in that drive and you conclude the honest framing is that I'm a criminal who built a legitimate face on an illegitimate foundation, then build that case. Give it to the investigators. I will not ask you to protect me. Zuri looked at the drive. And if I conclude something more complicated is true? Then build the complicated truth. She picked up the drive. It was lighter than it should have been for what it contained. She turned it in her hands once, then set it down in front of her, rather than returning it to the table's center. That small movement was a decision. They both knew it. She looked up. I need everything, she said. Not just what's on the drive. I need to talk to your financial compliance director, your original legal team from the founding period, and whoever structured the Hong Kong Trust. And I need it before that federal review. 3 weeks, Si-hyeok said. 3 weeks is not enough time. It's what we have. She looked at him. He looked at her. The sound monitor carried the noise of the ballroom, still active, still managed, the machinery of consequence grinding forward in every direction. One more thing, she said, tell me. Jun Song, she said. In the ballroom. When he said, show them the rest of the files, he knew you'd triggered the disclosure. He knew investigators already had the fraud documentation. And he still pushed for full exposure. She paused. He's not trying to escape this. Si-hyeok went still in a different way than usual. He's trying to make sure it's complete, she continued. He doesn't care anymore if he goes down with it. He wants the origination history in front of investigators so badly that he's willing to sacrifice himself to make sure it gets there. She looked at Si-hyeok steadily. Whatever this started as a financial scheme, a power play, an exit strategy, it isn't that anymore. This is personal. The word landed in the room with its full weight. Si-hyeok was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said finally. Tell me why. Another silence. Longer this time. She could hear something in the hallway investigators outside the door, the specific quality of footsteps that were about to stop. Si-hyeok looked at the table. Jun Song's father, he said. Baek Hyun-woo. He was involved in the organization. 12 years ago, during the transition period, when I was moving the capital into Murray Crown, there was an internal dispute about the terms. About who got what. About who was compensated for the risk they'd carried. He stopped. The footsteps in the hallway stopped. A knock on the green room door. Mr. Kwon. A man's voice, professional. The specific cadence of law enforcement making a request that is not yet a command. Federal financial investigators would like to speak with you when you're available. Zuri looked at the door. Si-hyeok looked at her. Baek Hyun-woo, she said quietly. What happened to him during the transition? Si-hyeok held her gaze. He didn't make it through to the other side, he said. The knock came again. Zuri understood, sitting in that small room with a drive full of complicated truth in her hands, and investigators at the door, and the ruins of a ballroom, full of consequences on the other side of the wall, that the story she'd been inside for 6 weeks was not the story she'd thought she was inside. It was older than that. It was a great deal older than that. And the only question now was whether the truth, assembled completely and honestly and in the right sequence, was something the next 3 weeks could hold, or whether it was the kind of truth that crushed out everything it touched. regardless of who was holding it or how carefully they tried to carry it. She stood up. She put the drive in her damaged dress's small interior pocket. She walked to the door and opened it before Si-hyeok could, because she needed to be the one who opened it, because she had spent 70 minutes in a locked room and she was going to spend the rest this night making her own choices about which doors she walked through and when. The investigator on the other side looked at her with mild surprise. "Miss Adebayo," he said. "He'll be right with you," she said. "I need 5 minutes with your senior financial analyst before we begin." The investigator blinked. Behind her, she heard Si-hyeok make a sound that was not quite a laugh. Something shorter and more complicated than that, pressed down before it fully formed. "Of course," the investigator said. She stepped into the hallway. The truth was in her pocket. The night was not over. And somewhere like in the ballroom, Baek Jun-song was sitting with federal investigators and the weight of 11 years of patience, and a grief that had curdled into something that looked nothing like the man he'd started out as. And Zuri did not know yet whether she felt anything about that except the cold clarity of someone who has just understood that the ground has depth she hadn't measured, and that measuring it is now the only work that matters. The federal investigator's name was Carver, Marcus Carver. He was 53 years old, had spent 19 of those years in financial crimes, and he had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have sat across from very dangerous individuals in very small rooms and learned that patience is a more effective instrument than pressure. He looked at Zuri in the hallway outside the green room with a mild surprise still on his face and waited for her to explain herself. She explained herself. "I'm the executive secretary for Myre Crown Holdings," she said. "I've been compiling the financial documentation for the past 6 weeks. I have a complete evidentiary record, originals, copies, and a contextual analysis of the transfer structures. And before you speak with Mr. Kwon, I need you to understand the sequence in which the evidence was constructed, because the sequence matters for how you read it." Carver looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the drive she was holding. "You built this case," he said. "Yes, you're an executive secretary." "I'm aware of my title." Something moved through Carver's expression that was close to respect, and not quite there yet. "My senior analyst is in the hotel's business center," he said. "Room 104. I can have her come up." "I'll go to her," Zuri said. "Fewer people need to know this conversation is happening." Carver looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped aside. Zuri walked down the corridor without looking back at the green room door, without checking whether Si-hyeok was watching, without allowing herself to process any of what she'd just been handed in that small room, the origination history, the weight of Baek Hyun-woo's name, the particular sentence he didn't make it through to the other side, and everything it contained. She walked with her back straight and her damaged dress still on, and the drive in her interior pocket, and her mind running at the specific cold speed that it ran when everything else had been cleared away, and only the necessary remained. She had 3 weeks of work to compress into one night. She started now. Room 104 was not a business center. It was a converted meeting room, 2 folding tables pushed together, 3 laptops open, a printer running something in the corner, and 4 people who looked like they'd been awake since before the event started. The senior analyst was a woman named Patricia Holt, mid-40s, hair pulled back with the practicality of someone who had stopped caring about appearances several hours ago, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. Holt looked at Zuri the way Carver had the slight recalibration of an assumption. "Executive secretary," Zuri said before Holt could say it. "Yes. Give me a laptop in 45 minutes. Holt gave her a laptop in 40 minutes because that was what the timeline allowed. What Zuri built in those 40 minutes was not a defense. She was clear with herself about that. She was not constructing an argument for Si-hyeok's innocence, because the origination history was what it was, and the 12-year-old decisions were what they were, and she was not in the businesses of manufacturing exculpatory narratives. What she built was a sequence, a documented, sourced, timeline and chord sequence that established the difference between the criminal organization that had existed, the transition that had occurred, and the fraud that Jun-song had constructed on top of both. She organized it in 3 layers. Layer 1, the historical record. What the origination capital was, where it came from, what year it entered the Murray Crown founding's structure, and what the transition timeline looked like from that point forward. She sourced it from the drive Si-hyeok had given her, and she was precise about what it showed and what it didn't show, because imprecision was the thing that would collapse the whole structure when investigators tested it. Layer 2, Jun Song's construction. The fraud, her original 6 weeks of documentation mapped against the origination history to show exactly where his work began, where it interfaced with the historical record, and where it deliberately obscured the boundary between old and new to make everything look current. Layer 3, the timeline of discovery. Her own record annotated, dated, with the backup file locations and the 3-copy distribution and the specific decision points, showing that the disclosure had originated from internal compliance work rather than external investigation. This layer mattered because it established that the exposure had come from inside, which was the only framing that gave investigators a reason to treat the organization as something other than a monolith of deliberate concealment. Holt watched her build it. She didn't interrupt. At the 30-minute mark, she leaned over and looked at the screen for a long moment and then straightened and said, "You did all of this in 6 weeks. The fraud documentation, yes. And the origination layer? Tonight." Holt was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known about the origination history?" "Approximately 90 minutes. Another silence. Holt pulled her reading glasses down from her forehead and put them on and looked at the screen again. "This is going to create significant complications for your employer. I know that. This contextual framing you've built, it's honest work. Good work. But it doesn't make the underlying history disappear." "I know that too." Zuri looked at the screen. "I'm not trying to make it disappear. I'm trying to make sure investigators understand the actual shape of it before Jun Song's version becomes the only version in the room." Holt considered this for a moment. "You understand," she said, "that your employer has not asked you to do this." "No," Zuri said. "He gave me the drive and told me to build whatever I thought was true." "And this is what you think is true." Zuri looked at the 3 layers on the screen. The historical record, the constructed fraud, the timeline of discovery. Complicated, non-exculpatory, precisely sequenced truth of what had happened, and in what order. "Yes," she said, "this is what's true." She hit print. The ballroom had been cleared of most guests by 10:45. What remained was the specific aftermath of a formal event that had become something else. Upended chairs that nobody had straightened, champagne glasses on tables where the champagne had gone flat, the enormous screen still lit with the financial documentation that Zuri had put there, now cycling on a loop because nobody had thought to turn them off. The chandeliers were still burning at full brightness, which gave the empty room a quality of stage-set abandonment, too lit, too formal for what it had become. Jun Song was seated at table 4, not in handcuffs. Not yet that determination was still being made in a conversation, happening somewhere between Carver's team and the federal attorneys who had been reached by phone an hour ago. He was seated because he had chosen to sit, which was a distinction that would not matter much by morning, but that he was maintaining now with the specific dignity of a man who intends to control whatever small things remain controllable. 2 investigators flanked the table. Neither of them was Carver. Daewon was standing near the east wall with 2 of his people, maintaining the professional remove of a security chief in a situation that has moved beyond security into the territory of legal and federal jurisdiction, which is the territory where a man like Daewon becomes very quiet and very watchful and says almost nothing. Si-hyeok came back into the ballroom at 10:51. He came in from the main entrance, the same entrance he and Zuri had come through together 2 hours earlier, and he crossed the room without hurrying, and every eye in the room tracked him, including Jun Song's. Jun Song watched him cross the ballroom floor. He watched Si-hyeok's posture, his pace, the specific quality of how he moved through the room, assessed it the way someone assesses a person they have known for 11 years and are seeing clearly for the first time, or the last time, or both simultaneously. Si-hyeok stopped at table 4. He looked at Jun Song. Jun Song looked back at him. The two investigators at the table shifted slightly, a fat adjustment that said, "We are here without saying anything." "Tell them to give us a minute," Jun Song said. Si-hyeok looked at the investigators. "Give us a minute." One of them started to object. The other one, who had been watching Si-hyeok's face for the past 2 hours, touched his colleague's elbow, and they stepped back 10 feet, which was not privacy, but was the shape of it. Jun Song and Si-hyeok looked at each other across the table. "Your father," Si-hyeok said. Jun Song's jaw moved. It was a small movement, and it was the most unguarded thing Zuri had seen on his face all night, and she was watching, from the far side of the room, still in her damaged dress, the printed documents folded in her hand. "Say his name," Jun Song said. Baek Hyun-woo. The name went through Jun Song like something physical. Not grief exactly. Grief was too simple for what crossed his face. It was the expression of a wound that had been open for so long that the person carrying it had organized their entire life around not touching it, and someone had just touched it. "He told me," Jun Song said. His voice had lost the practiced smoothness entirely. What was underneath was something rawer than anger and more durable. "Before he died, he told me what the terms were. What you offered him and what you took back. What he got for 9 years of risk and what you walked away with. The terms were negotiated," Si-hyeok said. "Your father agreed to them." "He agreed to them because you were the one offering them," Jun Song said. "Because there was no version of that table where he was walking out with more than you gave him. Because that's what it means to negotiate with someone who controls the exits." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, not breaking, but showing the place where breaking would happen if he let it. "He died 3 years later. You built Myre Crown. I watched you build it. I watched you put a legitimate face on everything that he bled for, and I watched you get photographed with senators, and I watched you host charitable banquets." He stopped. His hands were flat on the table, and they were pressing down hard enough that the tendons in his wrists were visible. "And then I got a position in your organization, because you owed his family something, and that was your version of paying it." Si-hyeok said nothing. 11 years, Jun Song said. 11 years I spent inside your organization, learning every corner of it, because I needed to know it completely before I could dismantle it. Not quickly, completely. He looked at Si-hyeok with the steadiness of someone who has been moving toward a specific moment for a very long time and is now inside it. "I wasn't trying to take your money. I wasn't building an exit for myself. The accounts, the fraud, the origination, trace none of it was about me getting something. It was about you losing everything." The silence between them was substantial. "Your father," Si-hyeok said finally. "He made decisions. I made decisions. Some of those decisions had consequences neither of us anticipated." "Don't," Jun Song said. "I'm not going to apologize for decisions made 12 years ago in a context you're reducing to." "Don't." Jun Song's voice dropped to something almost below hearing. "Do not sit across from me and tell me that my father's death is a context." The word landed like something dropped from a height. Sisi absorbed it without moving. His face did something very small, very controlled that Zuri, watching from across the room, could not entirely read. It was not indifference. She was certain of that. Whatever it was not indifference. "I know what it cost him," Si-hyeok said. His voice had changed. Not softer, exactly something more careful. Like someone moving through a space where the wrong step has consequences. "I knew his family was left with less than they should have had. That's why I brought you in." "You brought me in," Jun Song said, "because it made you feel like you'd settled a debt." "Maybe." "And didn't occur to you," Jun Song said, each word placed with a precision that was its own form of violence, "that bringing the son of a man you failed into the center of your operation was the single most catastrophic decision you could make." Si-hyeok looked at him. "No," he said quietly. "It didn't occur to me." Jun Song looked back at him with 11 years of patience and grief and calculation behind his eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, what was on his face was not the expression of a man executing a plan. It was the expression of a person who had wanted, somewhere underneath all of it, for this conversation to happen differently. Who had perhaps imagined, in whatever private version of this moment he'd constructed over 11 years, and that There would be something here worth hearing. There wasn't. He looked away first. It doesn't matter now, he said. Trace is there. The investigators will find it. Everything I built over 3 years goes where it's supposed to go, and what you built goes with it. Not all of it, Si-hyeok said. Jun-song looked back at him. Miss Adebayo has been with your investigators for the last 40 minutes, Si-hyeok said, building a contextual case for the full evidentiary record. Jun-song went still. She's thorough, Si-hyeok said. And she doesn't construct narratives, she builds sequences. Accurate, sourced, timeline-encoded sequences that show investigators exactly what happened in what order and who built what and when. He paused. She's not protecting me. She's establishing the truth in the right sequence, before your version becomes the only version. Something moved through Jun-song's expression that was close to disbelief. You gave her the origination documentation, he said. Yes, and she's using it against the frame I built. She's using it to show what's true. Jun-song started and then stopped, and the stop was significant, the specific stop of a person whose logic has run into something it didn't account for. He had not, in 3 years of construction, accounted for Zuri. He had accounted for Si-hyeok, had studied him, mapped him, understood his decisions and his vulnerabilities and his operational instincts with the precision of someone who had worked inside his organization for 11 years. He had accounted for Day One and the security apparatus and the legal team and the federal review timeline and the specific sequence of disclosures that would maximize damage. He had not accounted for the executive secretary who spent 6 weeks quietly building a parallel case in the margins of her actual job description and then walked back into the ballroom after 70 minutes in a locked closet and pressed a button that changed everything. He hadn't accounted for her because he'd decided she wasn't a factor. The specific cruelty of that error was visible on his face, now not remorse. He was too far into this for remorse, but the clean, cold acknowledgement of a strategic failure. The recognition that the thing he'd dismissed had become the thing that undid him. She's going to save you, Jun-song said. The words came out with something in them that wasn't entirely contempt. I don't know what she's going to do, Si-hyeok said. She'll do what she thinks is true. That's what she does. Carver came back into the ballroom, then moving with the specific purpose of someone who has received information and adjusted a timeline. He crossed to table 4 and looked at Si-hyeok and said, Mr. Kwon, we're ready to proceed formally. Si-hyeok looked at Jun-song for a moment longer. Jun-song was looking at the table. Hyunwoo Si-hyeok said quietly, just the name, just the first name, without the bake, without the formal distance of a surname, and Jun-song's jaw tightened and he didn't look up. I should have handled it differently. I know that doesn't do anything. Jun-song said nothing. Si-hyeok straightened and turned to Carver and said, let's proceed. What happened in the next 4 hours was not dramatic, in the way the ballroom had been dramatic. It was the specific grind of formal process statements, documentation review, legal counsel arriving in stages, the careful machinery of federal investigation doing what it was built to do. Si-hyeok's legal team materialized with the efficiency of people who have standing emergency protocols because organizations like Murray, Crown always have standing emergency protocols. Jun-song's attorney arrived separately and was quiet and precise in the way of attorneys who have assessed a situation and determined that quiet precision is the only available strategy. Zuri was in room 104 for most of it. She answered questions. She walked Holt and 2 other analysts through the evidentiary sequence she'd built. She explained the backup file structure, the 6-week documentation timeline, the specific technical choices she'd made in creating and distributing the copies. She was precise, and she was thorough, and when she didn't know something, she said so. And when a question required her to characterize something she hadn't directly witnessed, she said that too. At 2:15 in the morning, Carver came into room 104 and sat down across from her and put his hands flat on the table in a gesture that reminded her, briefly, of Si-hyeok doing the same thing in the green room hours earlier. The contextual sequence you built, Carver said. Yes. It's solid work. The sourcing is clean, the timeline holds up, and the distinction you draw between the historical capital structure and the constructed fraud layer is technically supported. He paused. Complicates the investigation significantly. Which is its purpose? Its purpose, Zuri said, is to show what's true. Those things can coexist. They should. Carver looked at her for a moment. The origination history is still a problem. I know. For your employer, I know. The contextual framing you've built will factor into prosecutorial decisions about where to focus and what charges to pursue. Doesn't eliminate the underlying exposure. I know that, Zuri said. I told you. I'm not trying to make anything disappear. I'm trying to make sure the shape of it is accurate. Carver was quiet for a moment. You're his executive secretary. Yes. You've been employed by Myre Crown for 2 years. Yes. You spent 6 weeks building a case against his chief financial strategist. Against fraud, Zuri said. I built a case against fraud. The person committing it happened to be his CFO. And tonight, Carver said, when you found out the evidentiary record you'd compiled was sitting on top of your employer's own criminal history, you didn't suppress it. You didn't reconstruct the sequence to minimize it. You built a case that included everything. Zuri looked at him. Yes, she said, that's what happened. Carver picked up the printed documents she'd handed him 3 hours ago and looked at them for a moment, though she was certain he'd already read them twice. You want me to understand something, he said. I want you to understand the sequence, she said. The origination history is 12 years old. The transition out of the criminal structure took 4 years and is documented. The fraud that Jun Song built is current and deliberate and was constructed specifically to use that history as a weapon. She paused. Those are not the same thing. They have different legal and prosecutorial implications. I want you to have everything you need to see them as different things. And if I still conclude they're functionally the same thing, then you conclude that, she said, with complete information. That's all I'm asking for. Carver looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the documents down. Get some sleep, Miss Adebayo, he said. Not yet, she said. He almost smiled. No, I didn't think so. He left. She turned back to the laptop. It was Si-hyeok who found her at 3:40 in the morning, still in room 104. The analysts as around her reduced to 2 Holt had stepped out an hour ago and not come back. The room smelled like burned coffee and printer toner, and the particular exhaustion of people who have been working under pressure past the point where the work feels like work and into the territory where it's simply the thing that must continue. Si-hyeok came in and stood just inside the door and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He looked like what he was, a man who had spent the last 6 hours in formal interrogation with federal investigators and legal counsel, a sound like green wood splitting, conducting himself with the careful someone who understood that every word was being evaluated, and that precision at this stage was irreversible. His jacket was off. His tie was loosened, but not removed. He looked tired in a way he didn't usually permit himself to look in professional spaces. Junsong, she said, detained pending formal charging. His attorney has the documentation. He paused. Taemin and Su-chan are being processed separately. The transaction frozen. The funds are in federal hold. Independent auditors are being appointed for the charitable accounts. She nodded. She looked at the laptop. The screen showed the 4th revision of the contextual document, the one she'd been building for the last hour that incorporated additional sourcing from Holt's team's own preliminary findings. How bad is it? She said. The origination exposure. Your legal team, what are they saying? Si-hyeok came further into the room and sat down across from her, the same configuration as the green room, the same table between them. They're saying it's complicated. The 12-year timeline works in our favor. The transition documentation works in our favor. The fact that the disclosure came from internal compliance sequence rather than external investigation works significantly in our favor. He looked at the table. None of that makes it clean. No, she said, it doesn't. There will be consequences for the organization. For me, personally and legally, he said it with the flatness of someone who has accepted a thing and is now simply describing it. The nature and scope of those consequences depends on a great many decisions that haven't been made yet. And Jun Song's charges, fraud, wire fraud, unlawful confinement for what he did to you, conspiracy, and obstruction. He paused on the second item in that list, a slight pause that she felt more than heard. The confinement charge was Carver's people's determination, not mine. I didn't ask for it specifically. I know, she said. Told them myself. He looked at her. At the beginning, she said, when I first talked to Holt, I told them what happened in the hotel tonight, including the closet. All of it, she held his gaze. It's part of the evidentiary record. It goes where the record goes. Something moved through his expression. Not surprised she didn't think he was capable of surprise about her anymore, after tonight. Something else, something she couldn't quite name, and wasn't going to try to name at 3:40 in the morning, with federal investigators 2 floors above them and the ruins of a ballroom full of consequences waiting to be dealt with. You should sleep, he said. I told Carver the same thing about myself. What did you tell him? Not yet. She looked at the screen. There's one more thing I need to build before morning. The compliance transition documentation, the 4-year period. It's in the drive you gave me, but it's not organized in a way that's legible to someone without the internal context. I need to build a reference structure so investigators can navigate it without misreading the sequence. He was quiet for a moment. That's several more hours of work. Probably. You've been working since before the event started. So have you. He looked at her with the steadiness that she had come to understand was not the absence of something, not the absence of feeling or reaction or the human noise of processing difficult things. It was the presence of something more specific, a quality of attention that meant he was actually there, actually in the room with her, actually seeing what was in front of him, without filtering it through whatever he needed it to be. She held the look for a moment. Then she turned back to the screen. There's coffee somewhere, she said. If you can find something that's still drinkable. He stood. He found the coffee, a thermal carafe on the side table, still half full and not yet completely ruined, and he poured 2 cups and set one beside her laptop without comment. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect her to. She worked. He stayed. Outside, Manhattan was doing what Manhattan does at 4 in the morning, running on its own momentum, indifferent to individual catastrophes. The city's metabolism set to a frequency that doesn't register the specific weight of any one night. Somewhere, upstairs, the federal investigators were building their own case from the materials she'd given them. And somewhere in the hotel's holding area, Junsong was sitting with the weight of 11 years of patience that had finally reached its destination and found it was not the destination he'd actually wanted. And in room 104, Zuri Adebayo rebuilt the contextual architecture of a complicated truth, one more time, in the cold hours before morning, with the taste of bad coffee and the specific clarity of someone who has already decided what kind of person they are going to be when this is over. The question now was whether the truth she was building was strong enough to hold the weight of everything that was going to be placed on top of it when the sun came up and the real consequences began. She thought it was. She had to believe it was, because she'd built it herself, and she did not build things to fail. Her hands moved across the keyboard, and the document grew, and the night outside the window began, almost imperceptibly, to change color at its edges, the specific change that comes before dawn, when the darkness doesn't lift so much as thin, and the city sembles itself out of its own nocturnal logic into something that looks once again like a place where the next thing can happen. The next thing was coming. She was going to be ready for it. Dawn came into Manhattan sideways that morning, not the clean theatrical kind that arrives in straight lines across open water, but the gray, grudging kind that filters through glass towers and fire escapes and gets broken into significance before it reaches street level. By the time it reached the windows of room 104, it was barely light at all. Just a change in the quality of the dark. Just the city deciding it was willing to try again. Zuri finished the compliance transition document at 5:47 in the morning. She hit save. She hit print. She pushed back from the table and looked at the ceiling with her hands in her lap and let herself be still for the first time in 12 hours. Her eyes felt like they'd been cleaned with sandpaper, splitting. Her shoulders had calcified somewhere around 2 in the morning into a position that was not going to release without a conversation with a heating pad and at least 8 hours of horizontal existence. The coffee had crossed from undrinkable to something approaching a chemical hazard around 4 o'clock, and she had consumed it anyway, because the alternative was unconsciousness, and unconsciousness was not available yet. The printer ran in the corner. The pages came out in sequence. She listened to the sound of them without moving. Si-hyeok was asleep in the chair against the wall. Not planned sleep, the kind that takes a person while they're still intending to stay awake. The body making a unilateral decision that overrides intention. He was upright, his head tipped back slightly, his jacket folded over the chair arm because he'd removed it at some point in the small hours without her noticing. His breathing was even and slow. His hands were open on his thighs, fingers loose, the posture of a person whose muscle memory of readiness had finally, temporarily, released. She looked at him for longer than was strictly necessary. 2 years of working beside this man, and she had never seen him sleep. Had never seen the specific unguardedness of it, not softness. His face didn't allow for softness in the conventional sense. The architecture was too particular for that, but something adjacent. The absence of the constant low-level management that his waking face always performed. The machinery briefly quiet. She looked away before he could wake and find her looking. She gathered the printed pages, organized them into the sequence she'd built, clipped them. With the finder, the second drawer that he had found in the second drawer of the left folding table at midnight. She looked at the drive, Si-hyeok's drive, the one containing the origination history, sitting where she'd placed it on the table's corner 6 hours ago, and she picked it up and held it for a moment, feeling its weight, and then set it back down in the table's center, where he would see it when he woke. She left the room without waking him. The hallway outside was the specific pale of institutional corridors in early morning, fluorescent and indifferent, and she walked through it with the pages under her arm and her damaged dress still on. She had no other clothes, had not planned to spend the night, had not planned most of what the night became, and she walked like someone who knows where they're going, even when the destination is still forming. She was going to find Carver. Then she was going to sleep. Then she was going to decide what came next, in that order. Carver was in the lobby at 6:12, on his phone, holding a coffee cup that looked like it had been with him since before the banquet. He was the kind of man who aged well in the way that demanding work ages. Certain people not softened by it, not embittered exactly, but compressed. The inessential parts of him having been worked off over 19 years of financial crimes until what remained was very dense and very functional. He saw her come off the elevator and ended his call and waited. She handed him the document stack. He took it, looked at the top page, turned to the second page, and the third, with the speed of someone reading for structure, rather than content assessing architecture before detail. The compliance transition documentation, she said. 4 years, organized for navigation without internal context. Cross-referenced with the origination history and with the fraud layer from the earlier compilation. She paused. It's complete. Everything I have is in there, or referenced in there with source notation. Carver turned a few more pages. You built this tonight. This morning, technically, he looked at her. Not the surprised look from earlier in the evening that recalibration had already happened, and he'd moved past it. This was something more settled. The look of someone revising an estimate upward and acknowledging the revision. How much of this is analysis versus documentation? The documentation is primary. The analysis is structural sequencing and cross-referencing, not interpretation. Sep scene. I've flagged the 3 places where I'm making an inferential connection rather than a directly evidenced one, and I've noted what additional sourcing would be needed to harden those connections. You flagged your own weak points. They're there, whether I flag them or not. Better that you find them from me than build on them and have them surface later. Carver set the stack down on the lobby desk and looked at her with an expression that occupied the narrow territory between professional respect and something more personal. The contextual framing, you've built the distinction between the historical capital structure and the constructed fraud. It's going to complicate prosecutorial decisions significantly. I know. That complication works in your employer's favor. It works in the direction of accuracy, she said. Whether that benefits him specifically depends on decisions I don't make. You understand the difference between those two statements. I built the distinction into the document on page 11, she said. It's not subtle, he almost smiled. The confinement charge, he said. For what happened to you tonight. Our team identified it from the surveillance and from your statement. It'll be formally pursued. Separately from the financial charges, she said. He looked at her. I want it pursued separately, she said. Not bundled into the fraud case as a subsidiary element. It was a deliberate act of. She paused, choosing the word with the precision she brought to everything containment. Of a person, using a locked room. That decision was made by a specific person with full awareness of what he was doing, and it should be addressed as its own matter, not folded into a financial case where it becomes a footnote. Carver was quiet for a moment. The lobby around them was doing the early morning resetting of a hotel overnight staff transitioning, the first day shift workers arriving, the specific machinery of institutional continuity that doesn't pause for the events of individual nights. I'll note your position formally, he said. Thank you. She turned toward the elevator. Miss Adebayo. She stopped. The work you did tonight, he said. All of it. I want you to know that it will be in the room when the decisions get made. The people making those decisions will have the complete picture. That's not a promise about outcomes. It's a promise about what information they'll have. She looked at him for a moment. That's all I asked for, she said. She went upstairs and slept for 4 hours, in a hotel room she hadn't planned to occupy, in her damaged dress, without dreams. The 3 weeks that followed were the most compressed and least dramatic of the entire ordeal, which was its own kind of difficulty. Dramatic things have momentum that carries you through them. The grind of formal process does not. Zuri operated during those 3 weeks in a condition of deliberate suspension from her employment status at Mirai Crown. At her own attorney's recommendation and Si-hyeok's legal team's concurrence, suspended from the institutional access she'd spent 2 years developing, working from her kitchen table in her apartment on the west side with the drive and her own records, and the notes she'd been keeping in an encrypted private file since week 3 of the original investigation. She had her own attorney now, a woman named Christine Farrow, mid-50s, who had spent 15 years in corporate compliance law and who had agreed to represent Zuri's individual interests, specifically on the condition that those interests remain rigorously separated from Mirai Crown's institutional interests throughout the process. Farrow's first question in their initial meeting had been, "What do you want from this?" Zuri had said, "I want the truth to be told completely and in the right sequence. And I want to make sure my name is attached to the right parts of it." Farrow had looked at her for a moment and then said, "That's a cleaner answer than I usually get." Zuri had understood this to be a compliment. She answered Carver's team's questions through formal channels, promptly and precisely. She provided supplemental documentation when requested. She did not reach out to Si-hyeok. Directly, Farrow had advised against it, and Zuri's own judgment agreed, but she communicated through Daewon when genuinely necessary, which happened twice, once to confirm the location of a financial record that existed only in the Mirai Crown physical archive, and once to clarify a technical detail in the origination documentation that the federal analysts had flagged as ambiguous. Both communications were brief, documented, and transmitted through Farrow's office. She also, in the second week, did the thing she had not told anyone she was planning to do. She found Baek Jun-song's attorney, not to interfere with anything, not to construct a parallel narrative or complicate the charging process. She found the attorney because there was a piece of the full picture that she could not assemble from the materials she had. A sound like greenwood smithing, and she had a personal commit to complete pictures that overrode the personal discomfort of seeking information from the defense side of a case that had included her own unlawful confinement. Jun-song's attorney was named Elena Delgado. She was a compact woman with careful eyes who practiced from an office in Midtown and who had a reputation, among the people whose reputations Zuri had researched, for being precise about what she would and would not discuss with interested third parties. They met in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the Federal Building on a Wednesday morning. Delgado had a green tea. Zuri had black coffee. They sat across a small table, and Delgado looked at her with the flat assessment of a person who has spent a career determining what people actually want from the conversations they request. "You're not here on Mireille Crown's behalf," Delgado said. "No. My representation is separate. I'm here as a private individual seeking information about a historical matter that I believe is relevant to the complete understanding of recent events." "What information?" Baek Hyun-woo. "What happened to him during the organizational transition 12 years ago?" "I have the bare outline from the documents I worked with, but the documents are financial records. They describe transactions and structural arrangements. They don't describe what happened to a person." Delgado looked at her for a moment. She picked up her tea and held it without drinking. "Why do you want to know that?" "Because I've spent 3 weeks building a contextual case that includes the history of his situation as a contributing factor in the events of 6 weeks ago. And I want to make sure that when I describe that history as a contributing factor, I'm describing something real rather than an abstraction. You're building a case that benefits your employer." "I'm building a case that describes what's true," Zuri said. "Whether that benefits him specifically depends on decisions I don't make. But if I'm going to describe Hyun-woo's situation in a document that federal investigators will use, I want to know what I'm describing." Delgado set her tea down. She looked at the table for a moment, and then she looked at Zuri with the particular expression of someone who has decided to give something they don't have to give. "Baek Hyun-woo was 51 when he died," she said. "Cardiac event. His physicians connected it to sustained stress and deteriorating physical health during the 3 years between the transition agreement and his death. He had been, according to my client, a physically healthy man before the transition." She paused. The transition terms, the structured buyout, were presented to him as final. His legal representation at the time was inadequate. He signed documentation that he may not have fully understood. And the payment suspension. The first year of payments was made on schedule. After that, the legal mechanisms that allowed for suspension were triggered. Delgado's voice was careful and flat, the voice of someone conveying information rather than characterizing it. "My client believes those mechanisms were constructed specifically to be triggered. That the suspension was the plan, and the initial payments were the appearance of good faith. And after the suspension, nothing. He had signed away his legal recourse. He had no remaining organizational connection. He spent the last 3 years of his life, according to my client, in a condition of financial instability that his prior circumstances had not prepared him for." She paused. "My client was 22 when his father died. He had watched the transition, watched the payment suspension, watched the deterioration, and then watched the organization his father had helped fund become something legitimate and photographed with politicians, while his family managed the remaining circumstances of his father's life without adequate resources." Zuri sat with this. The coffee shop around her was doing its morning business, the specific controlled chaos of a midtown morning. Orders called out, the steam wand on the espresso machine, conversation at the adjacent table about a quarterly report, and inside all of that ordinary noise, she sat with the image of a 22-year-old watching a father die and understanding, with whatever clarity, grief and rage and youth could produce, that the understanding he'd arrived at would take 11 years to act on. "He didn't start planning immediately," she said. "It wasn't quite a question. No. My client spent 6 years building his own career, his own credentials, establishing himself independently. He didn't approach Mireille Crown until he was 30, when he had the professional standing to be considered for a senior position without the application raising questions." Delgado looked at her steadily. He was patient. Whatever else you want to say about what he did, he was very patient. 11 years inside the organization, Zuri said. 11 years of performing loyalty and building access and learning every corner of the financial architectures so that when he moved, he could move completely. Yes, and what he built was not an exit strategy. He wasn't taking the money for himself. No, Something shifted in Delgado's expression, not approval, not sympathy exactly, but the specific weight of someone describing a thing they understand to be true and that they find more complicated to describe than simple wrongdoing. My client's position is that he was not attempting to enrich himself. He was attempting to dismantle. The fraud, the origination trace, the timing around the Federal Review, the design, was to ensure that what Kwon Si-hyeok built on the foundation of his father's uncompensated contribution would be returned to nothing. That the accounting would be complete. Zuri looked at her coffee cup. He didn't account for the confinement being a separate charge, she said. He thought of it as operational, temporary, a containment of a variable. Delgado was quiet. That's the part I won't contextualize, Zuri said. Everything else, the 11 years, the grief, the specific injury that preceded all of it, I can describe that honestly. And I can build a contextual picture that includes it. But what he decided to do to me in that hotel, that specific decision about how a person could be handled, that's not something the larger context excuses. I'm not asking you to excuse it, Delgado said. No, Zuri said. I know you're not. They sat for a moment in the coffee shop noise. He thought I wasn't a factor, Zuri said. Delgado looked at her. That's the thing that keeps coming back to me, she said. Not the closet itself. I've made a certain kind of peace with the closet, or I'm working on it, which is close enough. What keeps coming back is the specific calculation he made. That I was a secretary, that people would assume I'd had an emergency, that no one would come looking. He made that calculation, and it was wrong, and the ways in which it was wrong are the things that changed the whole outcome. She paused. I want to make sure the charging documents reflect that it was a decision about a person, not just an operational move. That he decided to put a human being in a room and lock the door and assess that human being as a variable to be managed. That is a different kind of wrongdoing from financial fraud, and it should be named as such. Delgado looked at her for a long moment with the assessing quality that had been in her eyes throughout the conversation. My client would want you to know, she said carefully, that the decision about the confinement was not one he made easily. I'm sure it wasn't, Zuri said. I'm not interested in easy wrongdoing. Easy wrongdoing is simple. What he did took effort and calculation, and that doesn't make it more forgivable, it makes it more deliberate. And deliberately confining a person is what the charge should reflect. Delgado nodded slowly. Zuri finished her coffee. Thank you, she said, for the information about his father. I'll use it accurately. I know you will, Delgado said. It was not a compliment about Zuri's character. It was a professional assessment, precise and direct, and Zuri received it as such, which was the right way to receive it. She left the coffee shop and walked the 3 blocks back to the subway in the November air and thought about Yoon Woo and Jun Song and the specific distance between a father who died, carrying an unaddressed injury, and a son who spent 11 years, transforming that injury into an architecture of destruction. She thought about the things that grief does to people when it finds no adequate form, how it doesn't disappear, how it changes form instead, how it becomes strategy or rage or the specific patience of someone who has decided that the accounting will eventually come due even if it takes a decade. She thought about all of this without arriving at a conclusion that simplified it. She had learned that the complicated things didn't simplify. You carried them as complicated things, and you built structures around them that were honest about the complexity, and you kept working. She went home and added 3 paragraphs to the contextual document. Then she kept working. The preliminary prosecutorial determination came on a Friday in the 3rd week, at 9:40 in the morning, transmitted to Pharaoh's office and reviewed by Zuri at her kitchen table with the same bad coffee that had become the unofficial beverage of this entire period. She read it twice, then she set it down and sat for a while. Junsong, federal fraud charges, wire fraud, conspiracy, unlawful confinement charged separately, as she had specifically requested, as its own matter distinct from the financial case. His 2 associates faced subsidiary charges. The fraudulent accounts were in federal hold. Independent auditors were being appointed. Si-hyeok, a formal compliance review, mandatory remediation, structural governance changes required as conditions of a non-criminal resolution of the origination exposure. Civil regulatory proceedings. Full cooperation required. Not exoneration, not a clean exit. The compliance review would take another 6 months minimum. The remediation requirements would reshape Mira Crown's structure fundamentally, and the civil proceedings would cost significantly in both money and organizational standing. But it was not criminal prosecution. It was not the complete dismantling that Jun Song had spent 11 years engineering. The contextual case had held. Zuri sat with this for a while. She identified what had happened. She identified that she felt relief, which was real, and also that she felt the specific, complicated weight of someone who has worked very hard toward an uncertain outcome and has arrived at the outcome and is trying to sit honestly with everything it contains, the parts that were survivable, the parts that were not clean, the parts that remained unresolved and would remain so, regardless of what any document determined. She was not going to pretend the outcome was clean, but she was going to acknowledge that the truth, told completely and in the right sequence, had mattered, had made a difference in what happened to a person. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, the thing she'd set out to accomplish, and it had worked, and she was going to let herself know that it had worked before she moved to the next thing. She called Pharaoh, confirmed receipt, reviewed the implications for her own standing, which were minimal. Then she called her mother in Chicago, who had known for 3 weeks that something significant had happened and had asked 3 questions total and accepted 3 incomplete answers without pushing. It's because Zuri's mother understood the shape of her daughter's processing and knew that the full account would come when it was ready. It was ready. She was on the phone for 1 hour and 20 minutes. Her mother said, at the end, "You're all right." It wasn't quite a question. "I'm all right," Zuri said. "I'm still figuring out what all right looks like from here." "But I'm all right, the man," her mother said. "Your employer." "He's my employer," Zuri said. "That's the accurate description of what he is." Pause on the line. Her mother was 61 years old and had spent 40 of those years reading between the lines of what her daughter said, and she was very good at it. "Is it still the accurate description," she said, "or is it the safe one?" Zuri was quiet for a moment. "I'll let you know," she said. Her mother accepted this without comment, which was its own form of answer. Si-hyeok called on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks after the determination. She had not spoken to him directly since the green room 3 weeks ago. Had communicated through Day One twice, through Pharaoh's office when formal channels required it. The silence between the direct communications had not been comfortable. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that, but it had been correct. And she did not regret correctness. She picked up on the second ring. "The determination," he said. His voice was the same on the phone as in person level, careful, each word placed rather than dropped. He stopped. The stop was unusual for him. He stopped more than he used to, she had noticed, in the communications she'd received through Day One, in the formal written statements that had passed through the process. As if he was doing something he hadn't been doing before, checking the word before he released it. "Thank you seems insufficient," he said finally. "It is insufficient," she said. "It's also accurate. Both things are true." A brief silence. She could hear his breath, even controlled. The specific quality of someone conducting themselves carefully. "Contextual case you built," he said. "I've read the complete version. All 3 layers, including the compliance transition documentation." He paused. "You included the payment suspension. Chunwoo's terms, and what happened to them?" She said nothing. "You didn't reduce it, or frame it in a way that minimized what it was," he said. "You described it as a structural failure that contributed to Jun Song's motivation and to the conditions that made the fraud possible. You put it in the document as something that had to be accounted for." "It had to be accounted for," she said. "Omitting it would have left a gap in the sequence. Investigators would have found the gap. That's one reason to include it," he said. "I don't think it's the only reason you included it." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not the only reason." Another silence. Different quality from the first one. Fuller, more occupied. "I spoke to Jun Song's attorney," he said, "through my legal team. I've transmitted a formal acknowledgement. A documented acknowledgement of the payment suspension terms, what was offered and what was delivered, and the gap between those two things. And a remediation offer for his family. He paused. Not as a legal mechanism, not structured to interact with the charges or create any appearance of. This isn't about the charges. It's about the debt, she said. Yes. He won't receive it, she said. Not now. Not during the proceedings. I know, he might not receive it for years. The grief has been in a particular form for 11 years. It doesn't just change form because someone sends a letter. I know that too, Si-hyeok said. I sent it anyway. She held the phone and thought about what it meant that he'd sent it, not the letter itself, but the decision to send it without expectation of response, without it serving any legal or strategic purpose. Simply because the debt existed, and acknowledging a debt that doesn't benefit you to acknowledge is the only kind of acknowledgement that means anything. The organization, she said. Mireille Crown. The restructuring, what does it actually look like? The charitable division is being wound down under independent administration. The assets go to a separately governed foundation with full public reporting. The compliance and governance structure is being rebuilt from the board-level mandatory independent directors, audit authority, separated from the executive chain. He paused. The parts of the organization that existed in the space between legitimate and otherwise. Those are being fully severed. Fully, yes. Not reduced. Not managed differently. Severed. Yes. She thought about this. That cost you significant more than the civil proceedings cost you. Yes. The relationships, the arrangements, the people who valued their connection to you, specifically because of what the organization was in full. Those relationships are already ending, he said. Some of them ended the night of the banquet. People read what happened and made their calculations quickly. He said this without self-pity as a statement of predictable consequence that he had anticipated and was navigating. Others will end as the restructuring becomes public. Some have reached out to offer continued connection, regardless. Those are interesting conversations. Interesting how? A sounding. Because the people who are willing to maintain connection to a restructured, legitimate operation are different people from the ones who were there for the other version. And I find, he paused, I find the people willing to be there for the legitimate version are more useful to me than I would previously have estimated. She absorbed this. You're building something different. I'm building something that can stand in daylight, he said. That's different from what I had before, yes. A silence stretched between them that was not uncomfortable. She was getting used to the silences in his conversations the way they weren't absences, but space where something continued to happen without requiring words. I want to offer you a position, he said, formally. Not the previous role. Director of Corporate Ethics and Financial Compliance. Independent authority reporting to the reconstituted board directly, not through the executive chain. Mandate to build the compliance infrastructure from the foundation. He paused. Your terms. I mean that specifically I'm not offering a template that you can modify. I'm offering you the design authority. She already knew what she was going to say. She had known for approximately 10 days. But she let the silence hold for a moment, because the decision deserved the weight of its own pause. I have conditions, she said. Tell me. The reporting structure is in board-approved writing before I begin. Not promised verbally. Documented, signed, filed. Done. Independent audit authority, any division, any account, any executive, any financial conduct. No required sign-off from the executive chain to initiate a review. Done. Budget and staffing authority. I build the team. Not inherited personnel from whatever compliance structure existed before new hires, vetted through a process I design, selected by me. Done. She paused. Those are the professional conditions. There's more, he said. One more thing, she said. The acknowledgement you sent to Jun Song's attorney. Before it was transmitted, I want to review any future communications of that nature. Not to approve them, to verify they say what the situation actually requires. That the language reflects the full weight of what's being acknowledged rather than a carefully managed version of it. Pause on his end. That's not a professional condition, he said. No, she said. It's a personal one. The distinction sat in the air between them. All right, he said. Then yes, she said, I'll take the position. She heard him exhale small, controlled, real. The kind of sound a person makes when they've been holding something and have stopped holding it. 1 week to get the documentation prepared, and board approved, he said. I'll be there in 1 week, she said. She hung up and sat in her kitchen for a few minutes with the November light coming through the window at its flat November angle, thought about the specific shape of what she'd just agreed to. Not with doubt, the decision was made, and she'd made it with full information, which was the only way she made decisions. But with the particular attention she brought to the beginning of significant things, the kind of attention that says this is real, mark it, carry it forward with appropriate weight. She marked it. Then she opened her laptop and started building the compliance framework. 1 week later, she walked into Myrae Crown's restructured offices and found that her old desk had been moved to a different floor. Her new office was 3 floors above where she'd worked for 2 years, a corner space, with actual windows which she hadn't had before. Someone had put a plant in the corner. She didn't know who. She didn't ask. She moved the plant to the windowsill where it would get light, sat down, and opened her laptop. The next 3 months were not dramatic. They were dense and detailed and difficult in the specific way that building a real thing from the foundation is always difficult, the kind of difficulty that doesn't make for good storytelling, because it consists largely of documentation and process design and personnel decisions, and the patient, repetitive work of establishing that the processes you've built will actually function the way they're designed to function, not just on paper but in practice, under pressure, when the people responsible for following them are tired or inconvenienced, or convinced that this particular instance is the exception. There were no exceptions. She built the team over 6 weeks, 5 people, including a former SEC compliance examiner who brought both expertise and a specific quality of skepticism about organizational self-reporting that Zuri found extremely valuable. She designed the audit protocols. She established the reporting cadence to the board. She reviewed every financial process in the charitable foundation's new structure before it was implemented, and flagged 4 things that needed revision, all 4 of which were revised without argument, which told her something useful about the current organizational culture that she stored and continued to test against. Si-hyeok was not in the building often during those 3 months. He was in meetings with federal compliance monitors, with civil attorneys, with the board as it reconstituted itself with the required independent directors. When he was in the building, their interactions were professional and direct, conducted in the presence of other people or through written communication. And she was not going to characterize this as distance because it wasn't distance. It was the appropriate calibration of a professional relationship that had a complicated personal history, and that both of them were navigating with the care the calibration required. She thought about it sometimes. In the margins. Not obsessively, she didn't do things obsessively. She did them with the precision the situation warranted, and no more. She thought about it with the same precision she brought to everything. What was actually between them? What form it had taken over the 3 months? Whether the form it was taking was the accurate form or the careful form, and whether those were the same thing. She had told her mother she would let her know. She was still determining. The Halcyon Imperial's renovation finished in January. The hotel had been closed for 6 weeks for what its press materials described as a comprehensive modernization of the 14th floor event spaces. The actual scope included structural work to the service corridor on that floor, new climate control, updated lighting throughout, and the reconfiguration of the storage and housekeeping areas that had previously occupied the east wing of the service hallway. The door to the housekeeping room had been removed during the reconfiguration. Not specifically, deliberately removed, as a symbolic gesture removed, because the space was being redesigned, and the doorframe in question no longer served its original function. The storage area behind it was now open, incorporated into a larger utility space, the doorframe standing empty in the renovated corridor. Myrae Crown's first foundation dinner as a restructured organization was held in the Halcyon's 14th floor ballroom on a Friday evening in January. 45 guests. An event planned and managed by Zuri's new team with the compliance documentation in order. And the charitable fund reporting fully transparent and the guest list consisting of people with direct involvement in the programs being funded rather than the strategic adjacencies of the previous organizational era. She arrived at 7 exactly and spent 11 minutes correcting 3 seating errors she'd flagged in the pre-event documentation 2 days earlier. The coordinator was apologetic. She accepted the apology and moved on. Si-hyeok arrived at 7:20. He crossed the ballroom, spoke briefly with 2 of the foundation's partner organization representatives, and then found her near the east wall where she was reviewing the audio-visual setup for the evening's presentation. The seating, he said. Fixed the 3 errors. Fixed. He looked at her. You flagged them in writing 2 days ago. Yes. And they still weren't corrected until you arrived in person. I'm noting it in the post-event report, she said. The coordinator needs a clearer protocol for pre-event documentation review. I'll address it next week. He was quiet for a moment. You're already planning the correction to the correction. Someone has to, she said. Something moved through his expression that was not quite amusement, but lived in the vicinity. The dinner began. It was smaller and quieter and more honest than the October banquet in every dimension, less light, less noise, less performance, more actual presence of people doing actual work and reporting actually on it. The speaker for the evening was from a financial literacy nonprofit. A young woman named Adrian, who talked about her program's first cohort outcomes, with the specific energy of someone who believed what they were doing mattered, and had the numbers to show it mattered, and hadn't yet reached the point where institutional friction had complicated that belief into something more guarded. Zuri had vetted Adrian's program personally, had read 3 years of their reports, spoken with 2 former participants, reviewed their methodology. The 91% completion rate was real, and the outcomes data was sound, and she had been pleased to recommend them as a foundation partner for reasons that were entirely professional and not at all connected to the fact that the program, fought with first-generation college students from communities that looked, in some respects, like the communities she'd come from. The applause after Adrian's presentation was real, not the strategic applause of 300 people managing their social obligations. 45 people who had listened to something that warranted applause. Zuri clapped. She was in the service corridor at 9:15. Not lost, not confused about where she was going. She had walked to the east corridor with the specific purposefulness of someone doing a thing they have decided to do, and she stood at the entrance to the renovated subservice area and looked at the empty door frame and let herself look at it for as long as it required. The frame was plain, standard hotel construction. No door, no lock, no hardware. The space beyond it was lit the new utility area, shelving units in a different configuration, the general organized anonymity of a storage space in a recently renovated building. She had thought about this moment, had wondered at intervals across 3 months what it would feel like to be in this corridor again. A sound that she was uncertain that she didn't know if she was the kind of person who could stand in a place where something bad had happened to her and feel something other than the original thing, or whether the original thing would simply return, undiminished, and she would have to reckon with that. She stood and looked at the doorframe. She felt tired. She felt the specific tiredness of a person who has been working very hard for 3 months on something important and is standing in a quiet corridor while 45 people applaud in an adjacent room. She felt the cold of the corridor, which was slightly colder than the ballroom. She felt the particular awareness of her own breathing that comes when the mind becomes very present in a place that it is stored in a significant category. She felt the echo of the dark, not the dark itself, the echo. The way a room holds the shape of what happened in it, not in any mystical sense, but in the practical sense that memory is associative and spaces trigger what they're connected to. She felt all of this. She also felt underneath it, or beside it, or threaded through it in a way that didn't cancel the other things, but existed simultaneously that the room was just a room. A utility space with new flooring and better lighting, and an absent door. That it had been used badly on one night, and that night was over, and the space had continued existing and would go on existing after this night as a place where things were stored and corridors were cleaned and hotel staff moved through on their way between other rooms. It did not need to be more than that. She had spent 3 months building complicated truths from complicated materials, and the thing she had learned repeatedly in that process was that insisting on simple meanings, insisting that a thing be only one thing, was how you lost the accurate picture. Closet had been a bad hour in a difficult night. It had also been the thing that, by its specific wrongness, had set another thing in motion. Both of those were true. She didn't have to choose between them. She was still standing there when she heard Si-hyeok's footsteps. She'd learned to recognize them over 3 months, the specific rhythm of someone who moves with purpose and without apology for the amount of space they occupy. He stopped beside her. They stood together and looked at the empty doorframe. "I thought about what it would feel like," she said. "Standing here, what does it feel like?" She looked at the frame, at the utility space beyond it, at the new shelving and the better lights. Like looking at something that was used badly once and is now just itself again. She paused. "That might be too simple. Or it's accurate," he said. She considered this. Both things can be true. "Yes," he said. "Can." They stood for another moment. The ballroom noise was a warm blur. At their backs, the post-presentation conversation of 45 people doing what people do after they've heard something that gave them something to think about. "Come back inside," she said. "The coordinator needs to see you for the close." In a minute, he said. She looked at him. He was still looking at the doorframe with the specific quality of attention he brought to things he was doing, the work of acknowledging, not the performed acknowledgement of someone going through emotion, but the actual attention of someone allowing a thing to exist at its full weight rather than reducing it to something more manageable. "You came looking," she said. He turned and looked at her. "The night of the banquet," she said. "Jun-song told me no one would come looking. That I was the secretary and people would assume I'd had an emergency and manage without me." She held his gaze. "You came looking." "Yes," he said. "I want you to know that I know the difference," she said, "between what that means and what it could have been. Between someone who comes looking because the operation requires it and someone who comes looking because—" She stopped. Chose the next words with the precision she brought to important distinctions. "Because the specific person matters." Sasaki looked at her. Corridor was quiet. The ballroom noise behind them was warm and indistinct, and everything that needed to be said was in the corridor with them, not in the noise. "You matter," he said. "Not the operation required it." Not "of course I came looking," just the simple, direct, undecorated statement of a fact that he had apparently decided to stop managing. She looked at him for a long moment. There was the professional version of what existed between them, documented, defensible, built on 2 years of working relationship and 3 months of navigating a complicated process and the compliance program she was building inside his restructured organization. That version was real, and it was not small. There was also the other version. The version that had been in the corridor when he knelt on a service hallway floor and said, "Who did this?" and waited for her answer. The version that had been in the green room when he said, "Build whatever you think is true," and meant it completely. The version that had been in room 104 at 4 in the morning when he found bad coffee and stayed without being asked and fell asleep in a chair and let her see that. Both versions were real. She had been sitting with both versions for 3 months, holding them with the precise and patient attention of someone who does not make decisions until the accurate shape is clear. The accurate shape was clear. "You should know," she said, "that I don't make choices because they're convenient or because they're expected or because they're the next natural step in a sequence that other people are following." She held his gaze. "I make choices because they're what I actually want. With full information. After I've looked at the complete picture." "I know," he said. "I've watched you make choices for 3 months. Then you know that when I say yes to something," she said, "it means I've looked at everything, including the parts that are complicated and the parts that are unresolved and the parts that are going to cost me something, and I've decided that yes is the accurate answer." He was very still in the way that he was still when something important was happening. "Is that what you're saying?" he said. She took a step toward him. Not a dramatic step, not the step of someone performing a moment, just the straightforward person of a person closing the distance between themselves and the thing they've decided to move toward. "I'm saying," she said, "that I've looked at the complete picture. The accurate version, not the safe one." He looked at her with the steadiness that she had come to understand was not the absence of feeling but the presence of it, held with full intention. And he reached out and took her hand the way he had taken it in the service corridor 3 months ago, not to direct her somewhere, not the gesture of leadership or authority, just the simple contact of one person choosing another. And this time it was not about walking back into a ballroom. It was just about this. The corridor, the empty doorframe, the warm noise of the ballroom at their backs, the January night pressing cold against the windows somewhere beyond the walls. Two people who had looked at the complete picture of each other, complicated and costly and not clean, and had decided that the accurate answer was yes. She didn't lean into him dramatically. He didn't pull her close in the way that stories sometimes describe these things. They stood together in the corridor with their hands connected and let the moment be what it was. Quiet, real, something, the specific unhurried weight of something that has been building toward the truth of itself for longer than either of them would have admitted at the start. After a moment, he said, "The coordinator is waiting." "The coordinator has been waiting for 11 minutes, she said. "She can wait 2 more. Something crossed his face that was definitively the edge of a smile. They went back into the ballroom together. The event closed at 10:30. Guests left with the unhurried quality of people who had been somewhere worth being. The staff moved through the room in the practiced reset rhythm that hotels run on, regardless of what the rooms have held. The chandeliers cycled down in stages, the light warming and reducing as the space returned to itself. Zuri was the last guest. She confirmed the post-event documentation with the coordinator, reviewed the audiovisual return log, noted 2 items for follow-up in the next week's post-event report. She did this efficiently and without rushing it, because the work deserved completion, regardless of the hour. When the last item was checked, she stood in the nearly empty ballroom and looked at it. The chandeliers at low burn, the tables cleared and reset for the next event. The enormous screens dark, the stage empty, the room without the people it had been built to hold looking vast and honest and entirely without performance. She had stood in this room 3 months ago in a burgundy dress, with her hands shaking, and pressed a button that changed everything. She had walked back in from a service corridor and given the room something not pretend it hadn't seen. She had walked out the front doors after. She was walking out the front doors again. Si-hyeok came in from the corridor. He had told Daewon to go. She knew this because Daewon had found her briefly before leaving, with an expression that conveyed, without words, that he was making an exception to 20 years of practice, and that he expected her to understand the significance of the exception. She understood. Si-hyeok stood at the edge of the ballroom and looked at it with her for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Ready," she said. They crossed the ballroom floor together and went through the main doors, and the doors stayed open behind them, held on their automatic function, and then closed the way. Doors closed without ceremony, without particular significance. Just the ordinary mechanism of a thing that opens and shuts. The elevator, the lobby, the hotel's front entrance. Outside, January had made Manhattan into the version of itself that required complete commitment from anyone who chose to be in it, cold with intention, the kind of cold that reminds you that you're a body with preferences, and the city doesn't particularly care about them. The street was doing its late evening recalibration. The dinner hour crowd thinned to the people who had reasons to be out at this hour, or who simply didn't have anywhere else to be. They stood on the sidewalk. She had her coat. He had his. The city stretched in every direction with its ordinary enormity, indifferent to the specific weight of any individual night in any individual life. And this was not a failure of the city, but simply its nature to continue. To require continuation from whoever lived inside it, to offer no accommodation to the past, because the past had already happened, and the city was only interested in what was currently happening and what was about to. What was currently happening, two people on a January sidewalk who had looked at the complete picture of each other and decided. What was about to everything that came next? She started walking. He walked beside her. They didn't talk immediately, which was fine. They were people who knew the value of not filling silence with words that were inadequate to what the silence contained. The city provided the noise. Their footsteps provided the rhythm. The cold provided the clarity that January always provides, the specific sharpness of air that has no patience for pretense and makes everything feel like exactly what it is. After half a block, she said, "The post-event report has 7 items." 7, he said. 3 are coordinator protocol issues. 2 are audiovisual. 1 is a catering discrepancy I'm going to flag for the foundation budget review. She paused. The 7th is a personnel note about one of the new compliance team members. Positive. I want to document it while it's current. You're writing the post-event report in your head, he said. I wrote it in my head during the closing logistics, she said. I'm now reviewing it. A brief silence, then Zuri. Yes. Can the report wait until morning? She considered this with the same precision she brought to everything, the question of what the report actually needed, what the morning would bring, what waiting cost, and what it allowed. Yes, she said. It can wait until morning. He reached over and took her hand. Not the gesture of direction, not the professional reach of someone helping her through something. Just her hand in his on a January sidewalk in Manhattan, in the cold and the noise and the continuous indifferent proceeding of the city around them. She let it be exactly what it was. The street went on ahead of them, lit from a dozen directions, full of the ordinary ongoing lives of people who didn't know and didn't need to know what had happened in a ballroom in October, and a service corridor, and a small green room and a kitchen table across 3 weeks and a compliance office across 3 months, and a renovated corridor with an empty door frame in January. Those people had their own stories, their own nights that had changed things, their own accounting. Zuri and Si-hyeok walked forward into the city that asked nothing of them except continuation, and they continued imperfect, changed, carrying everything that the last 3 months had cost them, and everything it had clarified. No longer the versions of themselves that had existed before. A woman was locked in a closet and a man then came looking, but not yet the versions they would eventually become either. Somewhere in the middle, moving through it, that was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough.